Hey there, in this I'm going to be talking about international relations for debate. Before diving into real substance, just a couple of quick warnings. First, this presentation will contain fairly extensive discussion of violence, war, famine, sort of all the stuff that's par for the course for detailed discussions of international politics and conflict. Second, you shouldn't take everything I say as absolute fact. You should do your own reading and fact check claims, particularly where they seem unintuitive. Third, this presentation doesn't necessarily reflect my personal views. It's mostly just intended as a debate resource. Fourth, and probably more importantly, this presentation was prepared in mid-December 2025, which means if you're watching this in the future, there's a reasonable risk that some of this information will be out of date, particularly stuff that's about ongoing conflicts or ongoing events or ongoing trends. Historical context will, not change its history, but state behavior, leadership, etc., all of that is prone to change over the course of time. Next, this lecture will probably be fairly long. The slideshow itself is pretty long, and the lecture will be as well. I think the best way to use this is probably to watch in parts, in particular, to watch the parts that you feel the least confident on or knowledgeable about, or figure out which areas of IR or domains of the world you're the least knowledgeable on, and then spend more of your time focusing on those. Relatedly, I'm not going to cover everything I've written in this presentation. This is more intended to be a sort of springboard resource of sorts to make you think a bit more about topics that maybe you otherwise wouldn't be as familiar with, but I won't cover in detail everything that I've written about in this presentation. Lastly, there's lots of topics that I just haven't included in this presentation. It's not because they're not important or even because they're not likely to show up in debate. It's just a matter of I focused on general themes and topics that I think are the most likely to come up in debate and that felt most relevant for this presentation. But there are entire conflicts and regions that are relatively less discussed in this presentation. The ones that are probably the most useful to be aware of as having been omitted from this presentation are tensions between India and Pakistan, particularly with respect to the April terror attack in Kashmir and subsequent dispute between India and Pakistan back in May 2025. There's a whole series of topics relating to Ethiopia that I don't touch on in much detail in this presentation. For example, tensions with neighboring Eritrea, tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam on the Nile, entire topics about Tigray and post-conflict reconstruction after the Tigrayan war with the TPLF. I don't talk much about Armenia and Azerbaijan, although I might discuss that a bit in the context of Russia-Ukraine. I will talk a bit about Turkey and Turkey's relationship with the Kurds, but won't discuss in extensive depth the sort of PKK demilitarization material that's shown up in the past year. I'm not going to talk about the Thailand-Cambodia border dispute. You can read about that independently if you'd like. I also won't touch much on the Western Sahara dispute. And I also won't talk in much depth about Transnistria, which is sort of showing up perhaps a bit more in the news, given the prospect for Russian gray zone warfare against Europe and Central Asia. So, without further ado, this is how I'll structure this presentation. I'll start with some miscellaneous advice on debating IR, then talk a bit about US-China, then Russia-Ukraine, then Israel, Iran, Saudi, a bit on Syria, and lastly, some miscellaneous topics that are important, but sort of just didn't get fit into those three overarching buckets. First, a couple of miscellaneous pieces of advice on debating IR. My first main point of advice is deploying fact claims. There's sort of a tricky issue in debating IR, which is that spec is sort of a hard instrument to deploy for a couple of reasons. One is that different judges evaluate spec claims in different ways. So some judges, for example, will know specific fact claims that you're making and will credit them as such. Some judges will know the specific fact claims that you're making, but won't feel confident as to whether it's ordinary intelligent voter level material. Some judges won't know whether or not the fact claims that you're making are true and will not know whether to evaluate those claims as correct. And in some cases, other teams will just contest your fact claims outright. And so how you deploy specific knowledge in IR debates can be a little bit tricky in that domain because there's lots of variables largely outside of your control in terms of how specific fact claims are adjudicated. My main piece of advice for dealing with this is to couple specific empirical observations with what I think of as narrativized explanations for why those facts make sense. So, for example, if you're going to make some empirical claim about, say, the incentives of Russian military leadership in the Russia-Ukraine war, you might cite specific fact claims about Russian military conduct or Russia's demands and negotiations, and then give a narrativized explanation for why it makes sense that Russia has those demands stance or is pursuing the war in that particular way. The best explanations typically draw on selectorate theory. I have a separate lecture that discusses selectorate theory if you want to focus a bit more on that individually. But the main way to deploy selectorate theory in this context is to identify the groups of people that leaders or governments depend on for power, and then explain how those actors maintain the support of those groups. So, for example, if you're analyzing the incentives of an autocrat or a dictator, it might make sense to talk about who is keeping that dictator in power and how do they ensure that those people stay loyal. So, for example, if you're debating a motion about US airstrikes against Venezuela or the survivability of the Maduro regime, you might focus on who does Maduro need to keep loyal in order for Maduro to stay in power, and how does Maduro do that? So, for example, you could talk about oligarchs, people with economic influence. You could talk about the security apparatus, like the military, the police force, intelligence agencies, etc., and how a dictator like Maduro will keep those folks loyal and in his camp. Like, for example, the provision of natural resources, control over state-owned enterprises, outright bribes, stuff like that. And so in that way, you can sort of develop a coherent model of how state actors behave that aligns with specific fact claims that you're deploying in a way that if a judge credits the fact claim, congrats, the claim just gets credited. And even if the judge is a bit unsure on how to evaluate the fact claim itself, they have a sort of supporting explanation to credit when evaluating the round. Second piece of advice is on concretization. Lots of IR debates suffer from abstraction in the sense that lots of the mechanisms that you'll deploy and impacts that you'll strive for are not particularly tangible or they're a bit difficult to conceptualize. So, for example, lots of people in debate will talk about allies and alliances, like X country will do this thing because they're allied with this other country, but they won't necessarily explain the causal mechanisms by which alliances change state behavior. Or, for instance, you might impact arguments to soft power. So suppose you have a motion that's like, as the United States, this House would reinstate funding for USAID. Maybe you have some gov argument that says USAID is good for the United States because it increases US soft power. That's a good argument and a very powerful argument for an actor motion, but it's a bit intangible, like why soft power matters or what it looks like. So making abstract mechanisms and impacts tangible is typically useful for weighing effectively in IR debates, especially when other teams have fairly concrete impacts like sanctions or death or control over territory. So for instance, rather than abstractly saying, say, Japan is a US ally, so Japan will behave in alliance with US interests. You could identify why that is. Like, Japan depends upon US security guarantees to protect Japanese territory like the Senkaku Islands against aggression from North Korea and China. Japan recognizes that defecting from its alliance with the United States would undermine the credibility of US security guarantees and increase the risk of territorial aggression against Japan. Because that is not in the interest of Japanese political leaders who care very much about Japanese sovereignty, it's in Japan's national interest to abide by its security relationship with the United States and keep the United States happy so that the United States continues to offer credible deterrence to Japan. Or in the context of soft power, you might say, when the United States has soft power on the international stage, or when China has soft power on the international stage, countries can use their soft power, like their favorable attitude amongst voters or the relationships that they build with politicians, to do things like get better terms on trade deals or gain concessions in mineral projects, etc., in a way that increases your hard power, like your economic and military capability. I'll give one sort of tangible example of where this abstraction often shows up in public discourse. There's a common argument you'll hear that one of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine is that Biden looked weak after withdrawing from Afghanistan. And that might be true. It might not be true in terms of what Putin's perception is. But the argument is pretty abstract. It's not clear why Biden seeming weak in Afghanistan changes Putin's calculus in Ukraine. And you could concretize that in a way that makes the argument a bit clearer for a judge. Like, Putin saw the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan as evidence that the United States had a limited tolerance for casualties. And as a consequence, Putin likely suspected that the Biden administration would not be willing to tolerate economic pain at home that would be caused by US sanctions on Russia if Russia invaded Ukraine. And as such, Putin probably thought that Biden would be unwilling to endure economic pain at home to punish Russia abroad. Something like that would be a more tangible mechanism for explaining the influence of Biden's decision vis-a-vis Afghanistan on Putin's decision vis-a-vis Ukraine. Third piece of advice in IR is about war arguments. Typical error is that when people make arguments about war, they'll make the argument in the form X policy causes war. There's lots of reasons why that's a risk, but the main one is that you'll always get hit with the same response, which is, well, X isn't the tipping point. Like whatever policy or issue you've identified as causing war, there might be 7,000 other things that could cause war or 8,000 other variables that would prevent war. And so it's typically pretty hard to identify one specific factor that causes war. The better way to make arguments about war is about increasing the risk of conflict. For example, you might make arguments about miscalculation, like a leader is more likely to miscalculate or misread actions by another state when tensions are high, or they're more likely to double down on escalatory moves when small skirmishes arise. For example, if, say, China and the Philippines both have ships patrolling the South China Sea, and two boats happen to ram into each other accidentally, high tensions mean that China is more likely to retaliate in a show of force to appease domestic hardliners. The Philippines responds hard in turn to show that it won't be intimidated by Chinese aggression, and the conflict soon spirals. So rather than making arguments that's like, this will literally cause this country to invade this other country, the better way to make arguments about war is about the probability of conflict increasing as a consequence of changes to leadership psychology or the cost benefit calculus of going to war or the sort of timelines under which leaders consider military operations. Last piece of advice is on prepping for IR debates. One thing, it's sort of the second bullet point here that I think is a pretty useful way to prep for lots of IR debates is most IR topics that are set are not original. And what I mean by that is not like CAs are uncreative. What I mean is that like almost all IR topics out there have probably been floated by at least someone. Like if there's any topic about sanctions on Russia or the conflict in Tigray or the war in Sudan or the conflict in Myanmar, there's probably someone, some smart scholar or expert or activist who's thought about some solution or proposal or idea, and there's a good chance that they've written about it. So nearly all IR topics have some existing literature on them. And so one of the best ways to just understand IR is to read opinion sections of major newspapers. By opinion sections, I don't mean that you should be reading extremely biased or overtly inaccurate arguments for, say, the United States invading Venezuela on trumped up charges, no pun intended, of narco trafficking in the Maduro regime, but reading the opinion sections of well-reputed magazines, think Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC, Al Jazeera, etc., is a pretty good way to familiarize yourself with what lots of people who think about IR are proposing and thinking about, etc. Second piece of advice vis-a-vis prepping for IR is history. Learning historical context is not very time efficient. For example, if you just read about the history of the Syrian civil war, you're probably going to improve your odds of winning a debate about Syria, but the odds that you debate about Syria and that knowledge is round winning is low in relation to any other number of things that you could do to prep. Nonetheless, I think as a long-term strategy, reading about historical context is one of the best ways to get better at debating IR for sort of two reasons. One is that you just gain better intuition for how states tend to behave and what motivates state behavior. So, for example, if you want to make more effective arguments about sanctions, it'll be useful to have read about previous cases where sanctions are applied. Not just that you can say, hey, here's XYZ case where sanctions were applied, like Iraq in the 90s, or North Korea since the missile tests, but more broadly so that you can have an idea for here are the conditions under which sanctions are likely to work or the conditions under which sanctions are likely to fail. The other reason is that lots of state behavior is not purely homo economicus. What I mean by that is lots of state behavior is not strictly driven by a utilitarian calculus in the sense of gaining money or hard power or military strength. In many cases, historical factors influence state behavior in ways that seem quasi-irrational. By irrational, I don't mean that in a derogatory or insulting way, like states are behaving stupidly. I mean irrational in the sense that it's not strictly driven in a sort of cost-benefit manner and is more driven by historical grievances or concerns relating to history. So a simple example of this would be Japan-South Korea relations. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's a pretty fair argument that says Japan and South Korea really should have been much closer allies, and even today should be far more militarily and economically integrated than they are on the basis of sharing a common external threat in the form of North Korea and China. But there are compelling historical reasons why that relationship is not as strong as it could be, like the legacy of Japan's occupation of Korea and Japanese-era war crimes against the Korean people. And so having some context on the Japan-Korea relationship is useful for debating about Japan and South Korea because it contextualizes state behavior in a way that might seem non-intuitive. Okay, that's the general advice on IR out of the way. Now let's dive into actual substance. First off, we're going to talk about US, China, and the rules-based international order. So the rules-based international order is a bit difficult to define. Antony Blinken, who is Secretary of State under the Biden administration, defined it in this very amorphous way, a system of laws and institutions that came about after the Second World War to reduce the risk of conflict. And there are many manifestations of the quote unquote liberal international order. There are economic and security dimensions to it, as probably two of the more important. Economically, that looks like Bretton Woods, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. A whole host of trade networks and monetary organizations that were intended to boost trade, to promote economic interconnection between different economies, to bring countries into the Western-led economic order. Think China being let into the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, for example, or the United States building NAFTA as a way to deepen trade integration with Canada and Mexico. In addition, the United States also has played a historically large role in the construction of security agreements. Think NATO, think the US security alliances in the Middle East and in East Asia with countries like Japan and South Korea. And of course, there's a whole slew of organizations that promote multilateral cooperation. In other words, cooperation between states, like the United Nations and the World Health Organization. And there's lots of reasons why the rules-based international order came into being. There's three important theories that underpin the rules-based order. One is commercial peace theory, which says countries tend to go to war less when they trade with each other. It's not that countries never go to war with countries that they trade with. A good example of this would be historically, many EU states thought that Russia would never think of invading Ukraine or any neighboring countries for fear of sanctions, but of course that happened. The logic behind commercial peace theory is if you trade with a country, going to war with that country is more expensive. Every person you kill is a customer that you just killed. Every road that you blow up is a transportation route that your companies can no longer use. Trade is also a way for companies to acquire resources without resorting to direct imperialism. So rather than the British Empire controlling half the world's territory, you can instead just trade on the international market. And trade also creates pretty powerful disincentives to go to war on the basis of political lobbying. If you're a large multinational corporation, conflict is expensive. It disrupts supply chains and damages consumer markets. And so you have an incentive to use your campaign finance resources to promote politicians that are opposed to going to war on a frequent basis. Obviously, that's not universal. For example, there are also ways in which lobbying can increase war. For example, large defense contractors would benefit from going to conflict. So there might be an incentive for a firm like Lockheed Martin, for instance, to lobby in favor of conflict, at least tacitly. But in theory, on the whole, trade reduces conflict. That's why the United States, after the Second World War, was interested in building organizations like the World Trade Organization, the GATT, NAFTA, and so forth, and also why the European Union is so keen on promoting free trade, monetary unity through the Eurozone, etc. Second underlying theory of the rules-based order was liberal institutionalism. Note that I keep using the past tense, like the rules-based order was this or was that. I'll talk a bit in a moment about the decline of the rules-based order, but more on that later. Institutionalism stands in contrast to two other theories of international relations, which are realism and constructivism. Realism is the theory of international relations that says the international system is anarchy. There's no higher power. There's no 911 that states can call if a country is in trouble. It doesn't have any higher order to appeal to. There's no stabilizing force in international politics. And given that states' highest order interest is the maintenance of their own sovereignty, states are always competing with each other. They're always skeptical of other states. And there's this endless risk of competition and military friction in the international system. Constructivists focus more on socially defined and socially constructed attitudes and the way that shapes state behavior. So the kind of simple intuition for constructivism is the United States and the United Kingdom and North Korea are three nuclear-armed powers. Most people in, say, the United Kingdom, prior to Trump at least, would certainly have thought of the United States as posing less of a threat to the UK than North Korea. But, in theory, that's a very confusing stance if you look objectively at what the United States and North Korea bring to the table in terms of military power. But the reason, at least up until Trump, why most people would have said, no, the United States isn't nearly as big of a threat as, say, North Korea, is because people have constructed a relationship in their mind between the United States and North Korea and the UK, which says that North Korea is a threat and the United States is not. So anarchy is what you make of it. social relationships define how states behave, and there's nothing hard or binding about the nature of the international system that makes war more or less likely. Institutionalism or liberalism is the third and final subset of major IR theories. The core claim of liberals, and this is not liberals in the sense of Democrats, but liberals in the sense of IR liberals, international institutions can change state behavior and shape states' incentives. So, for example, if you establish international norms, that creates normative expectations about what states should and shouldn't do. So, for example, the logic behind having treaties against chemical weapons is not that those treaties are going to singularly stop countries from using chemical weapons. The logic instead is that over the course of many decades, if you establish a social and cultural norm against using chemical weapons, and you establish a stigma against the use of chemical weapons, that changes state behavior over the long run. There are also harder ways in which institutions change state behavior. Probably the most compelling is the claim about iterated game theory. The logic is if you're a country, the reason why you care about honoring your promises is not because there's a real threat of punishment if you defect. The real issue is if you ever want your promises to be taken seriously in the future, it's in your interest to comply today. For example, the reason why a country that signs on to an international agreement prohibiting torture might have some inclination to follow it, even if they would otherwise like to say torture suspected terrorists, is if you want other countries to think of your promises in international law as credible, you need to establish that you do follow the treaties that you sign on to. So even if you don't really care about this treaty, you probably care about other treaties, which is why states have an incentive to abide by the promises they make. The final logic behind the rules-based order is democratic peace theory. The claim is empirically pretty reasonable, which is that democracies seldom go to war with other democracies. There are a whole slew of mechanisms for that, but the underlying implication of democratic peace theory for the international order is that for several decades, many Western states, the United States chief among them, played some role in the promotion of democracy. In some cases, that was probably quite good. Think Radio Free Europe or democracy promotion projects in Eastern Europe. In other cases, that was often quite destructive or harmful. Think nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the NATO air campaign against the Gaddafi dictatorship in 2011 under the Obama administration. But in any case, whether you love or hate the rules-based international order, it probably is under major attack. There's a series of reasons for that. Some I'll talk about in a separate lecture on the rise of anti-establishment populism in Europe and the rise of movements like the AfD in Germany or Reform UK in Britain. But I'll really focus here in this presentation on three core challenges to the international order. One is Trump, the second is China, and the third, which I'll discuss in the next section, is Russia and Ukraine. So let's start with Trump. So the first Trump administration was not nearly as bad as many people had thought, with the notable exception of January 6th and the assault on U.S. democracy. But in terms of U.S. foreign policy, Trump's first term was pretty surprisingly sensible in the sense that if you actually look at the people in Trump's cabinet, the people that were running the State Department or the Department of Defense, and the actual policies that Trump implemented in his first term, yeah, there were notable cases of bad or aberrational policies, but for the most part, U.S. foreign policy was fairly consistent with previous Republican or at least sort of neoconservative foreign policy experts in at least some domains, even if in other domains it was a bit more isolationist. For example, just take the case of Ukraine. Trump was the first president in the post-Cold War era to authorize the sale and the provision of offensive military weapons to Ukraine. Trump imposed new sanctions on Russia. Those are both examples of actions that could pretty reasonably be characterized as sort of sensible, conventional Republican foreign policy. Certainly not as neoconservative as a figure like, say, George Bush II or Dick Cheney, but the first Trump term was not a devastating shock to the international order. Of course, there were some exceptions. Think Trump withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord or partially defunding the United Nations and the World Health Organization, but the first Trump term did not destroy international order. The second term has gone quite a bit differently. In terms of NATO, that might be where the shock has been felt the most acutely. Several weeks into the Trump term 2.0, JD Vance, the US vice president, went to the Munich Security Conference and gave a speech that shocked a huge number of Europeans, where the United States pretty openly suggested via JD Vance that the United States does not view Russia as a very serious threat to Europe, and that the United States is more concerned about the alleged assault on free speech across Europe. That was sort of cemented as a concern a few weeks later when Zelensky traveled to the Oval Office, met with Trump, and was more or less berated just for defending Ukrainian sovereignty. The more recent shock that NATO's experienced from Trump is Trump's attitude towards peace in Ukraine, where the sort of recently unveiled peace proposal for ending the war in Ukraine that was drafted in part by Steve Witkoff, the U.S. special envoy under Trump, more or less reads at parts like it was drafted directly by the Russians. And probably the most definitive confirmation that this is not an aberration and that this will be the sort of attitude of the United States for the next several years came in early December when the United States released its national security strategy. The NSS is a document that's released typically once every term, sometimes twice a term, by every presidential administration in the United States. It's not binding in the sense that it doesn't dictate U.S. foreign policy, but it reflects the attitudes of policymakers in positions of power. And the U.S. national security strategy is very deviant in the way that it departs from previous security strategies and security doctrines. I actually recommend that you read it in full. It's about 30 pages. It doesn't take you too long. But it really is a shocking document in the way it approaches China and Russia. For example, the security strategy more or less openly says that Europe is facing, quote, civilizational erasure as a consequence of migration flows. And the document at no point actually categorizes Russia as a threat to U.S. interests and seemingly categorizes Europe itself as a greater threat to U.S. security than Russia, and even to some extent compared to China. There's a good piece in War on the Rocks that you can read that focuses on the national security strategy's attitude towards immigration. The main shift in the national security strategy compared to Trump's first term is that Trump is more or less now making the Western Hemisphere the highest priority of his administration. That looks in practice like cracking down on immigration, ICE deportation raids within the United States, military strikes against alleged narco traffickers in the Caribbean, and military operations potentially against Maduro's regime in Venezuela. That's a major departure from previous U.S. foreign policy. Historically, the United States has focused most centrally on three regions of the world in its military and foreign policy, those three being the Persian Gulf, East Asia, and Western and to some extent Eastern Europe. The United States has now pivoted towards making a hemispheric security strategy focused largely on stopping migration and, to a lesser extent, narcotics, the focal point of Washington's foreign policy approach. There's another piece that came from CSIS that talked about the potential implications for European politics. The national security strategy more or less openly calls for the United States to meddle with European elections in order to promote far-right parties or groups that are going to promote European birth rates and reduce migration from non-European countries into the EU. The national security strategy and Trump's shock to NATO is not the first sign that things are going poorly for Europe. NATO's credibility has probably been in decline ever since Trump took office back in early January or mid-January 2025. And the fact that the United States is not as credible a partner in NATO creates sort of two concerns for Europe. One concern is about Russian aggression. So NATO relies on Article 5, and Article 5 obligates, or at least on paper obligates, member states to come to each other's defense in a collective and mutual manner. The problem is NATO Article 5 is only as effective as promises are credible. So if you're Putin and you don't, for example, think that the United States would honor its pledge under Article NATO 5, you might be inclined to invade Poland or strike Estonia or go after the Baltics, believing that the United States will not defend Europe or come to NATO's aid. The second concern is that Europe is in a very bad position vis-a-vis its own military capabilities. After the end of the Cold War, around 1989/91, depending on when you want to define it, maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, Europe heavily downsized investments into its military forces. There's also other reasons for this, like, for example, after the Eurozone debt crisis, lots of European countries didn't have the spending power to invest heavily into their militaries and instead focused more on investments into the welfare state. And there is a real problem of free riding. Trump has spoken about this at some length, and although Trump lies a lot, he's not entirely wrong on this domain. He might be wrong now as Europe gets into action vis-a-vis military spending. But in the sort of 2 to 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, many European states did underinvest in their military, in part because the United States was sort of there to guarantee European security. That is now changing, both as a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sort of shocked Europe's belief that European war was not possible in the age of the 21st century and liberalism and the rules-based order, and also because of rising concerns that the United States won't protect Europe against Russian aggression. There's lots of illustrations of how Europe is taking its defense seriously. Rearm Europe is this project by the EU to increase defense spending across Europe by about 800 billion euros. There's entire mechanisms in place in the EU to lend low interest loans specifically earmarked for defense spending. Europe has relaxed some of its regulations on deficit spending to increase defense expenditures in European states. NATO recently agreed to up its defense spending to 5% of GDP by around 2035. That number is a bit of a misnomer. It really focuses on 3.5% of GDP being spent on core defense and 1.5% being spent on other miscellaneous defense-related activities. And that has seen some success. So Poland is now spending around 4% of its economy, or GDP, on defense. Germany reformed its constitution to increase the level of military spending. And in nominal terms, defense spending across Europe has risen by something like 50% since Russia's invasion back in February of 2022. Olaf Scholz, who was then the leader in the German Bundestag, the parliament, gave a fairly famous speech called the Zeitenwende speech that basically characterized the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and now, more recently, the US shift away from NATO as a turning point for Europe. Scholz called for an increase in defense spending that's since come into action more recently in the last several years. The key question that Europe now faces with respect to NATO and its military posture is whether or not autonomy from the United States is possible. So military capability is not just a matter of how much money you're spending. And there's a couple of reasons to believe that although Europe is now taking its defense seriously, that might not be sufficient to ward off Russian aggression. One concern is about fragmentation in Europe's defense industrial base. So the Draghi report is a report that was penned by Mario Draghi, the former IMF technocrat, as well as the former prime minister in Italy. And the report basically outlines a series of problems facing Europe's economy. One of those problems is a lack of consolidation in Europe's defense industrial landscape, which basically means the companies that are responsible for producing military equipment are fairly small, unlike in countries like China or the United States. Most of China's are state-owned. Most of the US's largest defense industrial players experienced rather rapid consolidation after the end of the Cold War. That's problematic for Europe because small defense contractors can't access economies of scale. Military production is very capital intensive. It requires lots of expensive machinery, large factories, experienced workers. And so if you only have relatively small companies operating only within domestic markets as opposed to large pan-European defense producers, it's a bit difficult for Europe to build at a sort of cost-effective manner the military systems that are needed to win modern conflicts. The second problem for Europe is that although Europe can increase its production of things like tanks or drones or artillery or howitzers with relative ease, there are lots of important military technologies, what are called strategic enablers, that Europe still depends almost entirely on the United States for. Probably one of the main examples of this is military satellites. The United States dramatically outpaces Europe when it comes to satellite capability. That's a real problem for Europe because you need satellites for things like intelligence gathering, for ensuring that missiles hit their targets, and stuff like that. The other problem, and probably the simplest problem, is just a money problem. Europe doesn't necessarily have infinite wiggle room when it comes to defense spending. One reason for that is that lots of European countries have limited fiscal flexibility. They're already cash strapped, they have large welfare states, they have aging populations that mean that tax revenues will decline with time. And lots of countries like France are already struggling to spend money on existing defense levels. So, for example, France's borrowing costs now approximate those of Italy. And even if Europe can overcome the fiscal problem, there's a timeline problem, which is if Russia is prepared to take operations against, say, Poland or Estonia or Latvia by 2027 or 2028, as lots of people think is potentially possible, or at least by the end of the decade, it's not clear if Europe's military capabilities will be sufficiently advanced by that point. It often takes years for defense contracts to be fulfilled. Building advanced weapon systems can take decades. So, for example, if you want to build fifth generation fighter jets, that's a years long program. You can't just do that overnight. And so there might be a time delay between the implementation of Europe's militarization policies and the actual manifestation of European strategic autonomy. And if Europe is not strategically autonomous before Russia strikes somewhere else, which we'll talk about more later in the Ukraine section, that's a potential concern. There's a good piece, by the way, by Mike Horowitz in Foreign Affairs that was published last fall that focuses on a specific or a specific problem for Europe when it comes to military power, which is the main doctrine in European militaries after the Persian Gulf War in 1991 was focused on precision-guided weapons. The logic was if you have very advanced weapons that can hit targets very precisely, you can win wars with relative ease, like, for example, against Iraq in 1991, or against Iraq again in 2003, or in toppling the Gaddafi regime in 2011, or in bombing Yugoslavia in 1995, and Bosnia and Kosovo in 1999. The theory is you can win these wars through precision. Modern war is, as Horowitz puts it, more defined by precise mass, which is to say a combination of precision weapons and a huge number of them. So it's no longer enough just to fire, say, 100 Tomahawk missiles. You're going to need thousands of fairly precise weapons like drones. And that means that Europe is not going to be able to get by with having a relatively small inventory of very advanced weapons. It's going to need a large inventory of fairly precise drones, missiles, etc. So that's the Trump shock to NATO. We can now talk a bit about the Trump shock to globalization and the international economic order. Trump's rationales for tariffs are a bit perplexing, and by a bit perplexing, I mean completely baffling. The reason is not only that many of Trump's reasons for doing tariffs are empirically questionable and logically baseless at many points, it's also because Trump's rationales for tariffs are often contradictory. So, for example, Trump wants, on the one hand, to impose tariffs on U.S. trade partners to raise revenue for the United States government as a way to reduce the U.S. budget deficit. At the same time, Trump is seemingly willing to cut deals that heavily reduce tariff rates as a way to kind of strong-arm countries into trade deals they otherwise wouldn't have signed on to. Logically, if you want to raise tax revenue, it doesn't make sense that Trump also has a whole series of policies that aim at reducing tariffs at other points in time. Another example of this would be Trump claims to want to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, where the U.S. imports more than it exports. But that's a bit perplexing when the United States is imposing tariffs on a country like Brazil, where the U.S. actually runs a trade surplus. So lots of Trump's rationales for tariffs are fairly contradictory. If you had to categorize them, there's somewhere between 3 to 5. One argument for tariffs is that they raise revenue. They are just taxes on imports, and taxes raise revenue, which means that the U.S. can either lower taxes or reduce the deficit at the federal level in terms of borrowing. Another argument is that the United States dollar is persistently overvalued, which means that U.S. manufactured exports are systematically non-competitive with countries like India, China, Vietnam, etc. So the United States needs tariffs as a way to sort of implicitly subsidize the U.S. manufacturing sector and protect it from global competition in order to boost manufacturing jobs. A third claim might be that the United States suffers from unfair trade practices, and that's why the United States needs reciprocal tariffs. Probably the best argument against this is if countries have bad trade policies, that's why you would negotiate for countries to reduce those trade policies as opposed to outright impose tariffs. A fourth argument is that the United States should decouple from China and, in addition, should reduce its China's ability to ship goods to third countries and then those countries ship goods to the United States to reduce U.S. dependence on Chinese imports. And a final argument is that the United States can leverage threats of tariffs to extract geopolitical concessions. For example, a positive illustration of this is Trump sort of using threats of tariffs to induce a temporary peace between Cambodia and Thailand several months ago. But there are also cases where this is fairly counterproductive. For example, the United States has imposed sweeping tariffs on India relating to India's purchases of Russian oil and gas. The problem with those tariffs is that they'll probably backfire and drive India closer towards Russia and China, which, if anything, means that the aim of the tariff policy, which is to sort of reduce India's consumption of Russian oil, will end up backfiring long run. That being said, regardless of what you think of Trump's rationales, the tariffs are here, and whether they're here to stay remains to be seen. There's a Supreme Court case that was recently heard relating to Trump's legal authority to impose tariffs. The reaction from justices in that case suggests that Trump's authority to impose tariffs under one particular law is probably going to be struck down. That being said, Trump has a range of legal and statutory ways to impose tariffs. That probably means that even if one specific avenue for tariff imposition is struck down, Trump will find others. But this is a major shock to economic globalization. Historically, the United States had promoted a reduction in trade barriers. The United States is now the champion of trade barriers in the form of tariffs and in the form of protectionism. That being said, the effects of tariffs have not been as catastrophic as some people had originally predicted. Back in April 2025, Trump announced what were called the Liberation Day tariffs, which were sweeping reciprocal tariffs on nearly every U.S. trade partner, with some of them being catastrophic. So, for example, there were projections of tariffs on Vietnam in excess of 60 or 70%. And Trump had originally threatened tariffs as high as 145% on China back in April. The worst of Trump's tariffs have been struck down or have not come into effect. Sometimes that's because Trump backed down. One reason Trump backed down on some of the reciprocal tariffs he announced back in April is because of dislocations in the U.S. Treasury market. For context, the U.S. Treasury market is the secondary market for U.S. government debt. It's the largest market in the world in terms of fixed income securities. After Trump announced Liberation Day tariffs, there was a bond sell-off as investors panicked about, or relatively panicked about, the state of the U.S. economy. That really concerned folks in the Trump administration and is one of the few indications that Trump is receptive to markets' reactions to his policies. The other reason that Trump's worst tariffs haven't gone into effect is because there have been a whole set of variables that have stopped Trump from implementing the worst of his policies. In some cases, courts have struck down the most extreme tariffs. In other cases, Trump has voluntarily delayed the imposition of tariffs to give time for negotiation to strike trade deals. In lots of cases, countries have just outright struck deals as opposed to retaliate against Trump, as many people had feared. For example, the European Union over the summer signed a ridiculously one-sided trade deal that more or less gives the United States unilateral access to European markets while maintaining a 15% U.S. tariff on European imports. And so in doing so, the United States has to some extent watered down its original tariff demands. And lastly, there's just a time delay at play here, which is the United States has announced tariffs and implemented tariffs for the last several months, but it takes time for tariffs to actually translate into things like high levels of inflation or significant reductions in exports, especially when many retailers spent the months prior to Trump coming into power and announcing tariffs stockpiling goods or swallowing some of the costs associated with tariffs. So that's why, if you look, for example, at labor markets in the United States, or if you look at global equity markets or even bond markets, the impacts don't look disastrous. So, for instance, if you look at the price that bonds are selling for, or if you look at the strength of the S&P 500, things seem to be going well. That doesn't mean that the tariffs won't have fairly destructive effects on the global economy or even on the US economy. It might just mean that some of these effects will come in down the road. The other reason that you shouldn't think too much about the strength of US equity markets is because large drivers of stock price increases have come from just seven stocks, the so-called Magnificent Seven. That's companies like Nvidia, like Apple, like Alphabet, like Tesla. And those are the companies that are really driving much of the growth. So the fact that the stock market, for example, is performing very well is not necessarily a compelling argument for why Trump's tariffs have been good. It just happens to be a case where a small number of companies are performing exceptionally well in terms of market valuation, and the rest of the economy will soon suffer. Outside of the United States, tariffs will have substantially more destructive effects. Large numbers of developing countries have historically exported large numbers of manufactured goods to the United States. As the United States reduces imports of manufactured goods from developing countries, that will cause pretty substantial economic pain for those countries. That being said, China's role in the US trade war is particularly interesting, especially when it comes to developing countries. So, US tariffs on China are a bit weird to understand. So Trump began a series of tariffs on China back in his first term. Biden largely extended and in many cases escalated those tariffs on grounds of national security and US-China great power competition, which we'll talk about in a bit. When Trump took office, he raised some of those tariffs further and then skyrocketed tariffs back in April 2025. Now, what's interesting about that is that China was one of the few countries to not blink, which is to say, while lots of other countries like Japan and South Korea struck deals with the United States where they agreed to invest lots and lots of money into the US economy, China was one of the few countries that outright refused to work directly with the United States in terms of capitulating to Trump. China more or less matched US tariff threats. So the United States said, we'll do 135% tariffs on you. China said, we'll do 135% tariffs on you as well. That led to a temporary trade truce back in May, and then a more recent trade agreement between Trump and Xi Jinping back in October that I'll talk about in a second. Before I talk about China's success in the trade negotiations with the United States, it's just worth mentioning how China has exploited US tariffs to sort of change the landscape of international trade. Lots of people expected that the tariffs on China imposed by Trump would result in a decrease in China's trade surplus. In other words, China exports more than it imports. Lots of people thought, well, if the United States, which is a major Chinese trade partner, imposes tariffs on China, it makes sense that China is going to export less. In fact, China's trade surplus for this year is projected to be about $1 trillion, which is a record high. And a major reason for that is because lots of countries are now buying more from China than they did previously. In other words, Chinese exports are being redirected elsewhere. Some of this is what's called transshipment. So, for example, if you're China or a Chinese company, you could sell goods to a Vietnamese importer, and then that importer could resell the goods to the United States. But lots of this does reflect a fundamental transformation of global trade, and that lots of countries are now doing more trade with China than they'd have done counterfactually as the United States isolates itself from the international trading system. So, for example, if you just look graphically at China's exports, there's no clear indication that Trump's tariffs have been effective thus far in weakening China's exports. And in fact, key industries like electric cars, batteries, etc., have seen a pretty dramatic increase in Chinese exports, in large part because China now has greater maneuverability when it comes to trading with countries that are now partially locked out of US markets, like Europe, East and South Asia, Africa, etc. And China has also sort of fairly effectively exploited this to increase China's geopolitical sway. So, for example, a few months back, China and ASEAN upgraded the free trade agreement that they've had. That's unlikely to have happened without US tariffs. Historically, ASEAN had pretty major concerns about China flooding ASEAN markets with cheap manufactured goods. That concern now is less pressing if the alternative of the United States is no longer as relevant. Many African countries have also increased trade and investment deals with China. The AU as a whole is a beneficiary of China pledging to reduce nearly all tariffs on African exports. That's a sort of good piece of evidence that Xi Jinping recognizes that this is sort of an opportunity for China to increase its influence on the international stage by increasing trade with countries that otherwise historically did lots of their economic interactions with U.S. companies and U.S. firms. Let's quickly pivot back to the US-China trade deal. China was one of the few countries to not blink when the United States started playing the game of chicken back in April. And China actually came out of the trade negotiations with the United States in arguably a better position than it entered. The question is why? Well, the main reason is back in Trump's first term, much of Trump's tariffs on China were either unexpected or China wasn't prepared for many of those tariffs, which is just to say that China was not prepared to insulate itself particularly well against the shock of Trump 1.0 tariffs. That has changed in Trump 2.0. And there are two specific ways in which China sort of found critical weak spots in Trump's position to exploit in order to force Trump to back down. The first and probably the most important is what are called rare earth minerals or rare earth elements. Rare earths are these kind of collection of elements that are very important for modern technologies, especially magnets. They're used in a whole bunch of things, cars, planes, phones, refrigerators, you name it, but they have especially important applications in the military. So, for example, the F-35 is one of the United States' fifth-generation fighter jets, and just to build a single F-35, you need something like 400 kilograms of rare earths. If you want to build a Virginia-class nuclear-armed submarine, you're going to need something like 4,000 kilograms of this stuff. Quick note on terminology. Although these are rare earths, they're not rare in the sense that they're rare or hard to find. They're rare in the sense that rare earth elements are rarely found in concentrated deposits, which means that you can find rare earths all over the place, relatively speaking. But the processing of rare earths is a very technologically and chemically difficult project because you have to separate rare earths from the surrounding material in the earth. The reason why this matters is China has huge control over the rare earths industry. Something like 70% of the world's rare earth minerals are in China itself, but much more importantly, Chinese firms dominate the processing and refining of rare earths. In particular, this isn't on the slide, but China dominates refining and processing of what are called heavy rare earths, which are basically heavier elements within the rare earth spectrum. Something like 99% of heavy rare earth mineral processing is done by Chinese firms. I think it's a single refinery in Vietnam that has been shut down for the last year or two. Is the only other potential way to refine those heavy rare earths. And the United States depends particularly significantly on heavy rare earths because it can't produce them domestically. So China discovered that it has huge control over rare earths, and it realized it could weaponize these. So China started doing this towards the end of December 2023, when it started to limit the export of technologies used to separate and process rare earths. The logic was that Western states were starting to recognize that depending on a geopolitical adversary for rare earth elements used in military products is a major risk. But Western states didn't invest nearly enough at that point in time to significantly reduce their dependence on Chinese rare earths. This is a graphical representation, by the way, of that dependence. And so what China did back in October 2025, after gesturing towards this in the previous months, was impose this vast licensing system to restrict U.S. firms from accessing rare earths. This is sort of an ironic move. I say ironic because the United States has imposed very similar export controls on advanced semiconductors, which are the technologies, we'll talk about them a bit later in the context of Taiwan and TSMC, but are the technologies used to power nearly all modern technologies. They're the chips that are used to power your phone, the computer that you're probably watching this on, etc. And so China more or less used the US playbook of choking off China's access to a critical choke point technology as a form of leverage, and China more or less did the same thing to the United States with respect to heavy rare earths. The other tool that China deployed was soybeans. Soybeans are a fairly large agricultural export for the United States. The reason they're important is because soybean farmers are a reasonably important demographic of US voters in swing states, and for that reason, they tend to matter quite a lot to whoever's in the White House. China, back in May 2025, more or less stopped purchasing soybeans from the United States and instead purchased nearly all of its soybeans from Brazil and Argentina. And so those two measures collectively were China's leverage in trade negotiations with the United States. And the logic basically is the United States threatened to impose punishing tariffs up to 150-ish% on China. And in response, China sort of unloaded two important weapons, one with respect to rare earths, the other with respect to soybeans. And at the outcome, China won. And what I mean by China won is that Trump and Xi Jinping convened in South Korea back in October, and the outcome of the deal that they struck was technically good for the United States in some domains. So China agreed to crack down on fentanyl precursor exports to the United States, and it also agreed to suspend that rare earth export licensing system for about a year and to purchase some soybeans from the United States. But the actual outcome is quite good for China in the sense that the United States did not impose sweeping tariffs on China, and more importantly, China has shown that it can weaponize export controls to force the United States to back down. The other recent change is that China convinced the United States to relax its semiconductor export control regime. For example, the United States is now letting NVIDIA, which is the world's most advanced chip designer, sell its H200 chips to China, which is sort of an improvement in China's ability to develop advanced artificial intelligence systems that rely on advanced semiconductors. So the implication of all of this, basically, for broader debates about US-China, before we talk about China specifically, is sort of two things. The first is it demonstrates the general change in Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping. So the general foreign policy pursued by figures like Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao in China in the sort of decades between roughly the 1990s and sort of early 2010s. Xi Jinping came into power in late 2012, early 2013. The previous Chinese foreign policy was sort of biding time and building power quietly. The logic was that China was building its economic and military powers. It didn't want to seem like a hostile threat to the West just yet. It wanted to develop its domestic capabilities before becoming more assertive and potentially hostile on the global stage. Xi Jinping sort of eschewed some of that logic and some of that rationale in his foreign policy approach. For example, after coming into power, Xi Jinping became increasingly and still is increasingly aggressive in terms of artificial island construction in the South China Sea, salami slicing tactics, naval excursions in the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, increased aerial incursions into Taiwanese airspace, and a whole range of measures that seek to increase China's international influence, like the Belt and Road Initiative, the sale of surveillance technology to governments like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, increased international influence by constructing alternative institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the Asia Development Bank or leadership in BRICS. There's a whole bunch of ways in which Xi Jinping has become more aggressive and assertive in China's foreign policy. The recent use of rare earths by China is sort of another piece of evidence of the change in Chinese foreign policy in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly the last several years when Xi Jinping has consolidated power, as I'll talk about in a bit. The second implication, more broadly, is for the sort of Chinese shock to the rules-based order. What I mean by shock is not that China seeks to completely subvert the US-led international system. There's an important distinction between China and the sort of three other countries that are often lumped in with China, which are Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It might be true that Russia, Iran, and North Korea are interested in a much more dramatic and revolutionary reconstitution of the international order. For example, if you're Russia, you're much more interested in directly challenging Western hegemony and pushing back NATO, etc. China, by contrast, is a bit different because China's rise as an economic power was in fact made partially possible by the international system built by the United States. So, for example, China's rise as an economic and manufacturing power was partially caused or contributed to by China's entrance into the World Trade Organization and the ability of China to trade with the West. The fact that China benefits from the international system or has historically benefited from the international system isn't a guarantee that China will respect the international system, but it certainly does mean that China's willingness to completely change the international order, to blow up the United Nations, to abolish the International Monetary Fund isn't really there. That being said, China does seek to undermine a series of Western institutions that Chinese diplomats and leadership view as having promoted Western values or ideology in a way that undermines or degrades national sovereignty. So, one of the main criticisms that China has of the US-led order is its revisionism, which is just to say that the United States and its Western allies, particularly in Europe, have weaponized institutions like the United Nations or World Trade Organization or International Monetary Fund to change to change and interfere with countries' domestic politics. So an example of that would be IMF austerity. The United States has substantial influence and de facto veto power over the International Monetary Fund. And one of the ways that the United States uses its leverage over the International Monetary Fund is to demand that when countries take bailout money from the IMF, they agree to partially liberalize their economies, market-based interest rates, opening up to trade, reducing deficit spending, cuts to social welfare, and so forth. That's an example, maybe a sensible one, but still very much an example of a US-led institution interfering with the politics of foreign countries. Another example would be US military operations. Think, for instance, the wars led by the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, the NATO campaigns in Serbia and in Libya, the United States' use of military bases across East Asia, in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, in Australia, maybe in the future in a country like Vietnam. And these are all examples of the United States undermining sovereignty. That's why China often frames itself in international forums as protective of country sovereignty and unwilling to intervene with countries' domestic affairs. All of that being said, that's why China does seek to promote a sort of reform of or change to the international order. That's partially why China's constructed alternative or parallel institutions. So, for example, you have the World Bank, but you also have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You have the G7, but you also have BRICS and a series of countries that are aligned with China in terms of challenging the Western-led order. And so the recent rise of Trump's challenge to the international order has given China an opportunity to expand its own influence through increased trade, through establishing itself as protective of country sovereignty, protective of the international trade system, so on and so forth. So with that out of the way, we can sort of now talk about more broadly China's rise as a geopolitical source of influence. So the singularly biggest reason China is now a major power on the international stage is that it's an economic power. Nearly all other sources of power, at least to some extent, derive or follow from economic power. So the size of your military is proportional to the size of your economy, the number of soldiers that you can hire, the number of weapon systems that you can buy, your ability to innovate and build advanced weapon systems. All of that depends on the size of your economy. Soft power is to a large extent proportional to or dependent upon economic power because your ability to provide international aid or offer humanitarian assistance is to some extent contingent on having financial resources. So China's rise as a geopolitical power is inseparable from its rise as an economic power. And China's rise as an economic power has been truly breathtaking. Over the last 40 to 50 years, China's economy has grown at a simply astounding rate. China's industrialized, it's urbanized, and it's become, depending on what metric you want to use, either the richest or second richest country in the world. For example, in terms of purchasing power parity, China's economy is greater than that of the United States. In raw nominal terms, the United States retains the world's edge in terms of economic heft. It's not just China's generic rise, though, as an economic power. China's risen specifically in terms of its manufacturing and military powers. China remains one of the world's most powerful manufacturers even today, as its manufacturing sector shifts elsewhere into other countries. And that means that China has lots of influence in international trade because tons of countries depend on China for their manufactured goods that maintain quality of life. Additionally, China is now becoming a technological power. For example, China seeks through what's called Made in China 2025 or MIC 25, which is a state-led initiative to ensure Chinese leadership in areas like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, but also environmental technologies like solar panels and electric vehicles. China has more recently begun to take climate change as a very real issue, both because climate change is a direct threat to CCP legitimacy, for example, as a consequence of floods and droughts and potential food and water shortages, but also because as the United States backs away from environmental leadership on the global stage, that's an opportunity for China to increase cooperation with countries that also view climate change as a very real threat. And the issue that's probably gotten the most attention in Western media has been China's rise as a military power. So back in September 2025, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, China held a major military parade where the People's Liberation Army, which is China's national military, showed off all of its cool gadgets and gizmos as to its military powers, like its missiles, its air defense systems, its nuclear weapons, so on and so forth. And China's nuclear arsenal has also expanded dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. China now has something like 600 nuclear warheads within its possession. There's two things I'll talk about specifically in terms of China's relationship to international politics. The first is China's international economic role, and the second is China's international security role. So let's start on economics. The most immediate way that China has become an economic superpower is the Belt and Road Initiative. It's about a $1 trillion-ish infrastructure project that aims to deepen trade and promote Chinese influence in more or less every major theater of the world. Think Latin America, Africa, East Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Oceania, you name it. And the main driving force of the Belt and Road Initiative, excuse me, is infrastructure construction. So China sought to construct a whole range of systems that promote trade. This isn't just physical infrastructure like bridges or highways, but it's also digital infrastructure, undersea cables, 5G networks, clean energy projects, a whole bunch of programs aimed to promote Chinese economic interconnectedness with lots of other countries, something like 150 of them. A relevant question is, what are China's motives for the Belt and Road Initiative? The reason why this is useful for you as a debater is because if you want to debate about the Belt and Road Initiative, it's probably a useful idea to understand why China does the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, the argument that people used to make a lot about the BRI was that China uses the Belt and Road Initiative to debt trap countries so that when countries default on their loans, China seizes infrastructure as collateral. That argument has problems, but the underlying issue with the argument is not necessarily that it's a terrible argument, but rather that it reflects a very specific characterization of China's incentives for the Belt and Road Initiative that might not necessarily be true. So characterizing China's motives for the Belt and Road Initiative can sort of help you better make arguments about why the BRI might be good for growth, good for development, good for security, or why it might result in increased levels of corruption or white elephant projects or stagnant growth and over-indebtedness, etc., in recipient countries. So the first and probably the most obvious benefit for China is just that the Belt and Road Initiative is good for China's economy. Probably the most boring reason for this is just trade. If you're China and you have $1 trillion of infrastructure projects all over the globe, that $1 trillion is tangibly and immediately good for the Chinese state-owned enterprises and contractors that build those bridges and roads and highways and ports. And the resulting trade flows that are made possible, so think, for example, railroads and dams, that makes it easier and cheaper to trade, which is in turn good for Chinese manufacturers and exporters. One of the particular reasons this is good for China relates to overcapacity. So one of the most persistent problems facing China's economy, arguably even more of a pressing problem in the long run than something like its real estate crisis or its demographics problem, is its overcapacity issue. So overcapacity at a very simple level just means China produces so many manufactured goods, both advanced goods, for example, electric vehicles or solar panels, but also low value added goods like industrial goods such as steel. And China produces so much stuff that it can't be absorbed by the domestic market and increasingly can't be absorbed by international markets either. There are lots of reasons why China has an overcapacity problem. You can read all about it. I've listed a handful of them here. Janet Yellen actually gave a speech. She was the Secretary of Treasury under Biden, gave an entire speech just talking about this. But broadly, you can identify a series of reasons why Chinese firms overproduce and often produce even when it's not profitable to do so. One is that China has a very high savings rate and by extension a very low consumption rate for an advanced economy, which means that China has very high levels of investment but relatively low levels of domestic consumption, which means that Chinese firms, especially those that receive lavish subsidies from the state, often end up overproducing even when domestic consumption can't meet that production. Additionally, China's tax system rewards local governments where lots of manufacturing is happening because China's value-added tax system raises tax revenue at the point of production as opposed to at the point of consumption, which means that local governments stand to benefit by increasing production in their specific area, even if that production is arguably inefficient in the medium to long run, which means that China overproduces lots of goods like steel, solar, etc. And also on top of that, there's lots of reasons why China's state-driven economic model tends to overproduce. For example, state-owned enterprises have what's called a soft budget constraint. That basically means that lots of SOEs don't need to be profitable because they expect bailouts from the government should they ever run into financial hardship. The reason that's relevant is China's industrial overcapacity can be partially mitigated through the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's probably even easier now that the United States is pulling back from international trade agreements. For example, China now can sell many of its manufactured goods abroad and not just to countries like the United States or Europe, which is also imposing or has historically imposed tariffs on China. And that in turn means that the BRI expanding trade opportunities helps China solve its industrial overcapacity problem. The other reason why the BRI might be good for China's economy is sort of twofold. One is the internationalization of the renminbi, which is China's currency, as well as the expansion of the renminbi in financial transactions. For example, some countries are now issuing what are called panda bonds, which are bonds denominated in the Chinese yuan. Lots of cross-border trade is increasingly denominated in the yuan as well. That being said, there's a bit of a tendency to exaggerate the degree to which the RMB is internationalized. It's true that the RMB's role in the international financial system might be expanding. At the same time, China's financial sector remains subject to very tight capital controls. And in addition, the United States dollar, even under Trump, remains very much the world's most dominant currency, particularly in terms of oil contracts, in terms of cross-border payment flows, in terms of foreign exchange markets, in terms of the holdings of central banks. So although the RMB might be on the rise, it certainly hasn't toppled dollar diplomacy. The second other way the BRI might be good for China's economy relates to the sort of middle income trap. So one of the problems that the Chinese economy faces today is that it's trying to do something that very few countries have done successfully, which is to transition from a low value added manufacturing based economy to a high value added technology driven economy that is more advanced in areas like semiconductors or quantum computing. The logic here is that China doesn't want to be perpetually locked into the lowest or even the middle tiers of the global value chain. The CCP wants to expedite China's advance up the global value chain by shifting into more advanced technologies. Consequently, the Belt and Road Initiative might help with that. So, for example, if China can increasingly outsource low-scale manufacturing towards BRI partners and instead focus more of its capital and land and human personnel and labor into industries like AI or semiconductors, that might expedite China's knowledge economy, its shift towards information technology, so on and so forth. In particular, this is useful for China's dominance in green energy. So China is now one of the world's largest producers of wind, solar, and EVs. That's only going to increase over the next 2 to 3 years, given the opposition in the United States to thinking seriously and caring seriously about things like solar panels and electric vehicles, as well as the fact that Trump has more or less gutted the Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden passed back in 2022 as a sort of signature environmental act that aimed to subsidize electric vehicles and solar panels. That means that China is now positioned to sort of become the world's green superpower, which matters quite a lot because lots of countries are pivoting towards green energy. For example, renewables in 2025 have now surpassed coal in terms of total energy production. And given that lots of developing countries do care very seriously about reducing reliance on fossil fuels and take the issue from climate change seriously, this probably gives China, as it pivots even more towards production of clean energy, a leg up in its competition with the United States for global influence. Secondly, and related to that final point, the Belt and Road Initiative is useful for expanding China's international influence. So, China has a sort of reputation in debate as a debt trapper. The probably more compelling argument that you can make is not about debt trapped diplomacy, the claim that China over indebts countries deliberately as a ploy to then force countries into defaulting so that Chinese firms can seize the underlying infrastructure like ports or bridges as collateral. The probably more accurate argument is about statecraft. So, what China is fairly well known to do is to weaponize its economic relations with other countries to pressure countries, much as Trump is now doing to US trade allies, into geopolitical concessions that are favorable to China. So, probably the best known example of this is China will use and leverage its economic relations with countries, including BRI projects, to pressure countries away from recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign country. Back in 2021, for example, Lithuania very briefly moved towards working diplomatically with Taiwan. China responded with sort of overwhelming economic fury and sort of pressured Lithuania to back down. This does extend, though, beyond just the issue of Taiwan. So, for example, back in 2016, South Korea was implementing, and ultimately did implement, THAAD, which is Terminal High Altitude Air Defense. It's a US-built missile defense system. And South Korea was considering building, or rather imposing, a US-built THAAD missile defense system in South Korea. China responded by economically penalizing South Korea. So China stopped imports of particular South Korean goods. It discouraged and in some cases banned Chinese tourists from visiting South Korea. And it did so to pressure South Korea away from installing the THAAD missile defense batteries. It ultimately didn't succeed, but South Korea most likely learned its lesson because 4 years later, when China cracked down fairly repressively on protests in Hong Kong, South Korea was, that is, South Korean political leadership was much more quiet about the Hong Kong crackdown than you might have otherwise expected, probably because South Korean leaders recognized pretty reasonably that speaking out against China was going to land them in hot waters when it came to economic retaliation. The reason that this is relevant is that China can leverage its international economic power through the Belt and Road Initiative to pressure countries into sort of concessions that are favorable to China. For example, China can pressure countries to vote in accordance with Chinese interests at international forums like the United Nations. China can leverage countries to side with with China on matters pertaining to territorial disputes. And in a potential hot conflict over Taiwan, which we'll talk about in a moment, China potentially has a pretty major bargaining chip on its side, which is it can threaten to cut off, for example, rare earth exports to Western countries that supply aid to Taiwan. It can threaten to stop selling manufactured exports to countries that are very much used to relying on Chinese manufactured exports. And in that way, China has lots of influence. That's expanded through the Belt and Road Initiative now that Chinese firms have fairly direct control over the sort of arteries of trade, think ports or railways, where if a Chinese firm can stop, for example, shipping or stop telecommunications or cut deep sea cables, that has pretty tangible implications for the global economy. The final major motive for the Belt and Road Initiative that's worth thinking about, and this is, I think, one that's probably the least deployed in debate, but I think is the most interesting because this is probably the basket of arguments that you can most easily deploy to show that the BRI is inefficient. The argument is, well, if the BRI is mostly about security, or at least partially about security, it's no wonder that many BRI projects aren't economically profitable because that's not even the main priority. But you can make a series of arguments that the BRI exists to advance China's security interests. So we'll talk about this, and then this will kind of segue nicely into discussing Taiwan. There's two ways theoretically that the BRI does this. One of them is a bit less compelling, which is just that The BRI provides China with infrastructure that is useful for long-range military operations. So, for example, China now has a military base in Djibouti, but it also has lots of what are called dual-use ports, which are basically ports that are theoretically intended for civilian usage, like shipping goods, but could theoretically be used by military vessels in the event that China wants to send naval vessels abroad, for example, into South Asia, East Africa, and so forth. The more consequential way that the Belt and Road Initiative has changed Chinese security relates to the Malacca Dilemma. So the Malacca Dilemma looks something like this. China is the world's largest net consumer of energy, and that's probably going to increase over time. And importantly, China imports a very large amount of its energy, both oil and gas, as opposed to producing it domestically. And what's particularly important is a very large proportion of China's imported energy comes from Middle Eastern countries, think Saudi Arabia or Iraq, although the proportion that's come from Russia has increased pretty substantially since the invasion of Ukraine, when China started buying Russian crude at a discount. Even with Russian imports, the Middle East remains the largest supplier of imported energy to China. So, why does Middle Eastern oil create a security dilemma for China? Well, it's basically the Malacca dilemma. So, the Malacca dilemma basically is if you're transporting Middle Eastern oil or gas to China, you're almost certainly doing it by sea because that's the cheapest and fastest way to get energy from the Middle East, like from Saudi, into China. The problem is that the most economically sensible route to take forces you to pass through this little strait here called the Malacca Strait, which is adjacent to Malaysia and down towards the south towards Singapore. The problem is that the United States Navy operates in the Malacca Strait, and it also has a relationship with Singapore that permits the use of naval facilities in that country. The consequence is that in the event that the United States wanted to deal massive damage to the Chinese economy, setting aside that the United States could theoretically lock China out of the dollarized financial system, the United States could also deal a huge amount of damage to the Chinese economy by blocking the flow of oil through the Malacca Strait, which in turn would have devastating consequences for the Chinese economy, at least in the short term before China finds a workaround. That's partially why the Belt and Road Initiative is good for China's security. The main reason for this is that China has built a series of infrastructure projects that allow it to import energy without energy passing through the Malacca Strait. So, for example, the sort of largest project, or one of the largest projects in the Belt and Road Initiative, is called CPEC, CPEC. That's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's a major infrastructure initiative between China and Pakistan, and one of the projects that was built through CPEC is the port here. You can sort of see it visually. And the reason why the Gwadar port matters is that it allows China, and increasingly as the port's capacity grows over time, it allows China to unload natural gas that passes or is transported by sea into Pakistan, and then that gas can be transported by pipeline or by truck to China by land, and that allows China to import natural gas without that gas having to pass through the Malacca Strait. There's a similar deal over in Myanmar where the Chinese government has authorized the construction of a fairly vast port that similarly allows China to import energy without that energy having to pass through the Malacca Strait. In that way, China can reduce its reliance on imported energy that passes through the Malacca Strait, which reduces U.S. leverage and Western leverage writ large over the Chinese economy. That brings us nicely then into discussing Taiwan and the potential conflict between the United States and China. So, in order to understand China's ambitions vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's sort of useful to have some historical context. And the context that's most useful to have in mind relates to the Century of Humiliation. The TLDR of the Century of Humiliation, at least what you should probably know for debate, is that China had a long history prior to the 1800s of cultural and geopolitical greatness. That greatness was gravely undermined beginning in the 1830s with the first Opium War launched by the British, and in the following sort of century, really 110-ish years, China experienced a successive series of wars and conquerings and one-sided deals and territorial agreements and arrangements that dramatically weakened Chinese sovereignty. So China was invaded repeatedly, foreign powers instigated violence within China. Japan occupied vast swaths of Chinese territory. And it was only in 1949 when the Communist Party won China's decades-long civil war over the nationalist Kuomintang that Chinese sovereignty was reunified. And as a consequence, one of the founding narratives and one of the foundational claims to legitimacy in the CCP is that the Chinese Communist Party is the party that restored Chinese greatness and tangibly restored Chinese sovereignty and unity. And that narrative features very prominently in contemporary Chinese ideology. By Chinese ideology, I specifically mean CCP ideology. And that's intensified in the last 5 to 10 years under Xi Jinping, in the sense that the narrative that the CCP reunified China and established Chinese greatness after the Century of Humiliation is all over speeches and documents and newspapers and radio statements put out by the Chinese Communist Party. And that has two implications for Chinese foreign policy, at least. One implication is that Western imperialism is particularly problematic from China's point of view. So, for example, one of the main qualms that China has with the United States and East Asia is that the United States maintains a vast military presence right near China's border. So the United States has huge military bases in South Korea and Japan. It has a vast naval force that's always patrolling waters that China considers historically Chinese. And on top of that, U.S. allies in the region, like the Philippines or to a lesser extent Vietnam, contest China's claims to sovereignty over the South China Sea. And the United States tacitly backs at least some of those disputes, i.e., its allies' claims to territory. And from China's point of view, it's difficult to not draw parallels to the Century of Humiliation. A Western power maintains military and economic influence in China's rightful sphere of influence, and that for China is probably an unacceptable arrangement. The second implication relates specifically to territorial disputes. There's a major difference in how Chinese leaders talk about external affairs and internal affairs. So, for example, if you read statements from Chinese leaders about the Russia-Ukraine war, most of the statements are fairly moderated. They're professional, they're diplomatic. When you read statements about domestic territorial disputes, the language is always much more forceful, and China's response to countries that question Chinese sovereignty is orders of magnitude more assertive. So, for example, China does not view, questions about Taiwan's sovereignty as acceptable questions to ask on the international stage. And similarly, matters that relate to China's own internal security are very sensitive for the CCP. So, control over Tibet or Hong Kong or Xinjiang in the West, or Taiwanese independence. These are all issues that are deeply controversial and off topic, off the table for the CCP. And the reason why these topics matter so sensitively to CCP leadership is because territorial integrity is very central to the founding narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. And as Xi Jinping promotes the Century of Humiliation narrative in the last decade, it's increasingly central to CCP legitimacy. Taiwan is particularly important in this because Taiwan is the one remaining territory that China considers rightfully Chinese that really isn't under Chinese control and, more importantly, complicates the CCP's claim to having reunified China. So there's a common argument you'll hear, particularly from Western politicians, that China is a revisionist power. So, for example, a spokesperson for the Biden administration a few years ago said that China is the only country that has the intent and the capacity to reshape the international order. And the capacity part is contestable, but the intent part is very rarely questioned in the West, and even to some extent in debate. It's actually debatable whether or not that's true. Whether or not China is an internationally revisionist power is questionable. There's a great article that was published in MIT's International Security Journal this past summer called "What Does China Want?" that basically just looks at a huge corpus of Chinese text and manifestos and statements to determine whether or not this characterization is plausible. The article basically concludes that China might be, not might be, is very forceful when it comes to matters pertaining to domestic sovereignty and Chinese border security. But when it comes to foreign affairs, China is not nearly as revisionist in the sense that China is not that intent on exporting its economic or political model abroad in the way that the United States is intent on exporting its model of, say, liberal democracy and free state or free market capitalism abroad. But China very much does distinguish between internal and external matters when it comes to domestic Chinese affairs and domestic Chinese sovereignty and foreign affairs that operate outside of Taiwan's borders. The other piece of context that's useful for understanding China's ambitions vis-a-vis Taiwan relates to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is the current paramount leader of China, and he's consolidated power in a way that's largely unprecedented since Mao Zedong. For context, Mao's leadership was ruinous for the Chinese state and the Chinese people. Tens of millions of people died under Mao's rule in China, for example, as a consequence of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that caused mass waves of famine and huge levels of purges and political violence. After Mao Zedong left power in the 1970s, after his death, the Chinese government imposed a whole set of reforms aimed at limiting the ability for one leader in the Chinese governing apparatus to dominate politics in the way that Mao Zedong had dominated politics. That has been partially undermined by Xi Jinping. So, for example, Xi Jinping has secured an unprecedented third term as president of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping has built a very strong cult of personality around himself. His ideology has been officially incorporated into Chinese documents. And a very tangible way in which Xi Jinping has consolidated power is by purging allegedly corrupt officials from Chinese governance. Now, it is true there is a very real problem of corruption within the Chinese bureaucracy, within the military, within the party. That being said, the scale of the anti-corruption purge, in which something like 3 to 5 million members of the Chinese government and Communist Party have been ousted from power, many of them have been imprisoned, many of them have had their assets stripped. It's questionable whether really all of those people are corrupt, or, as is probably true in many cases, if they're seen as threats to Xi Jinping or insufficiently loyal to Xi's ideology. The anti-corruption purge, which is chiefly carried out by this organization called the CCDI, basically the discipline organization of the Chinese Communist Party, has targeted both what are called flies and tigers, which basically means low-ranking bureaucrats and high-ranking powerful Chinese officials. For example, the highest organ in Chinese politics in terms of power is what's called the PSC, or Politburo Standing Committee. It's a 7-person organization that's more or less the most influential body in Chinese politics. And Xi Jinping has even targeted and ousted and purged members of the Standing Committee, which was basically without precedent since the 70s and the days of Mao. And he's also targeted military leadership in the CMC, or the Central Military Commission. For example, back in 2023, he removed one of the highest ranking members from a defense-related perspective of the CMC in order to install loyalists. So where does that leave us vis-a-vis Taiwan? Well, what it basically leaves us with is that China cares deeply about reunification with Taiwan, given the centrality of Chinese reunification to CCP legitimacy, and also, for that matter, to Xi Jinping's legitimacy. In addition, China's military has undergone dramatic modernization in the last 10 to 20 years, and its nuclear arsenal has expanded by a factor of 3 to maybe 4. Xi Jinping has centralized power around him. That creates a specific risk, which is part of the reason Vladimir Putin invaded Russia back in, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, not Russia, back in February 2022, is because the people around Vladimir Putin were largely yes men. They probably supplied the information that Putin wanted to hear as opposed to the information that Putin should have heard, which led Putin to underestimate the probability of Ukrainian resistance and overestimate the capacity of Russia's military. A similar risk could potentially play out with China. If Xi Jinping increasingly purges disloyalists from the military, it's possible that the people around him eventually start feeding him the information he wants to hear, not the information he should hear, which might potentially cause China to needlessly escalate against Taiwan without understanding the requisite risks. And in addition, Lots of external observers worry that Taiwan's safety is increasingly in jeopardy over the next 2 to 5, even 10 years. One reason for this is what's called the Davidson window. There's a widely reported statistic, you'll read it in just about any news article about Taiwan, that most Western intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency in Langley, believe that China has, by Xi Jinping, that has been given an order to have its military prepared to take Taiwan by force, for example, in an invasion or a blockade by 2027. That's called the Davidson window. That doesn't mean that China is guaranteed to invade Taiwan, for example, by 2027. It just means that that's the expected timeline by which the People's Liberation Army should be prepared for such an invasion. And the other concern relating to that is Trump. It's not clear if Trump would defend Taiwan against assault. And the relevant question to ask in debates about this is not, would Trump actually defend Taiwan? The relevant question is, does Chinese military and political leadership believe that Trump would defend Taiwan? Because that determines whether or not China actualizes its military ambitions over Taiwan. Briefly, I'm going to talk about advances in China's military and why the prospect of a Sino-American war is no longer a guaranteed US victory. For brief context, the major doctrine in Chinese military thinking during the Cold War was called people's warfare. The logic was to build a large army and to impose overwhelming costs on any country that sought to invade China. Then, in the early 1990s, the United States led a 42-country coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq. And the main outcome of that war, from a military doctrine point of view, is that the world recognized the power of what's called PGMs, or precision-guided munitions, basically long-range, highly precise weapons, especially missiles, that can hit targets with pinpoint accuracy. There are two ways in which precision-guided weapons sort of changed warfare from China's point of view. I have a separate video that talks about this in greater depth. One is the main logic that authoritarian states had, including China, previously had about the United States, is that the risk of war with the United States was not a major concern, because as long as warfare relied heavily on soldiers, in other words, you had to deploy soldiers to fight for territory and control territory, there would always be a handicap on the ability of democratic states to fight war. And the handicap is democracies don't like casualties. They don't like seeing soldiers come back in body bags, which puts real political pressure on governments not to go to war. But if you can fight and win a war through the skies, if you can fire highly precise weapons from 2,000 miles away and defeat the enemy without, having tens of thousands of soldiers die in battle, that goes away, and the risk of war as a consequence potentially goes up because Democrats' disincentives to go to conflict are reduced. The second implication of precision-guided weapons is that countries can win war through technological supremacy, or at least that's the theory. There's an excellent book by Robert Pape called Bombing to Win. It's the sort of primary criticism of that argument. I think it's well worth the read if you're ever interested. I won't summarize all of his arguments here, but it's worth flagging. But the TLDR of this argument says if you can cripple an adversary's critical military nodes, things like air defenses, command bunkers, communication systems, satellites, computer networks, etc., then you're basically going to destroy your enemy fairly easily because you're fighting against an enemy that's deaf, dumb, and blind, as one PLA textbook put it. What that meant is, during the Cold War, China relied on a low technology, high mass approach to warfare. After the Cold War, with the invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent US campaign to recapture Kuwait from Iraq, that changed, and it was further cemented after the US led our NATO campaign in Kosovo in 1999. And the main doctrine that came out of that was the doctrine of informationization. The logic is, if you want to win war, from China's point of view, you need to dominate information supremacy. In other words, you need to control access to information, the flow of information. You need to know where your enemy is located, what your enemy is thinking, where your enemy is planning, and so on and so forth. So what does that mean in terms of China's actual military capabilities? Well, the informationization revolution, so to speak, in the People's Liberation Army has led to pretty dramatic improvements in China's military capabilities. And of course, this has been made possible by vast increases in Chinese wealth that allows the Chinese state to invest fairly heavily into military modernization. And the consequence of this is a huge advancement and improvement in what's called China's reconnaissance strike complex. The reconnaissance strike complex basically is the collection of weapons and intelligence systems that allows you to identify targets and destroy targets very accurately. So first on reconnaissance, China now has some of the world's most advanced abilities to identify targets with pretty remarkable accuracy. China has advanced radar systems. It's built artificial islands with the almost singular purpose of adding radar stations that can see even farther out into the Pacific Ocean. China has also vastly increased the size of its satellite constellation in a way that allows its missiles and drones and military commanders to make better informed decisions and to target more accurately. And in addition, China has a whole slew of fairly advanced aircraft that are now capable of monitoring for targets, identifying locations, communicating, so on and so forth. At the same time, China's ability to strike targets with pinpoint accuracy has increased. In particular, the DF-26 and DF-21 are probably the two, like, to the extent that you care about memorizing missile names, these are probably the two I'd commit to memory, are fairly advanced weapons that China's rocket force now possesses. They're called the Guam Killer and Carrier Killer because they can be launched against Guam bases. Guam is one of the largest U.S. military bases in the Indo-Pacific, and the DF-21 is famed for being able to sink aircraft carriers, which are multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrying vessels that the United States uses to project power. And what that means is that a combination of advanced missiles and fifth-generation fighter jets, coupled with the fact that China now has the world's largest navy by total number of ships, plus a shipbuilding capacity 232 times that of the United States, means that China now has a very formidable reconnaissance strike complex. The outcome of this reconnaissance strike complex is what's called A2AD. A2AD stands for anti-access aerial denial. It's basically the set of technologies that allows China to prevent the U.S. military from operating effectively in the Western Pacific. There's an excellent study that was published a few months back called Access Denied. It's basically a war game that looks at the efficacy of Chinese missile strikes against U.S. military bases in the Indo-Pacific. I'd recommend at least reading the abstract if you're interested. The TLDR of what the study finds, more or less, is that the market improvement in China's long-range strike capabilities, coupled with its increase in reconnaissance abilities, means that the United States would struggle to operate effectively in the air in any war against China over Taiwan. So what this basically means is China might be able to defeat the United States in a Sino-American conflict owing to the dramatic improvements in China's naval abilities, and the ability to achieve information supremacy by disabling critical nodes in the United States military's Indo-Pacific presence. The related question, of course, if you want to talk about a prospect of Chinese aggression against Taiwan, whether that's a blockade or an invasion, is whether or not the United States would intervene militarily to protect Taiwan. In the status quo, the United States policy is called strategic ambiguity. The logic is that the United States isn't willing to commit either to certainly protecting Taiwan. That potentially could cause Taiwan to unilaterally declare independence, which in turn increases the risk of war. And the United States also doesn't want to fully abandon Taiwan because strategic ambiguity acts as de facto deterrence against Chinese aggression against Taiwan. So the question is, if push came to shove and Xi Jinping attacked Taiwan, either to cement his legacy or maybe as a diversionary war to reduce attention on China's domestic economic problems like over-leveraged property sector, its debt crisis for local governments, rising youth unemployment, deflation, underconsumption, industrial overcapacity, etc., would the United States intervene? There are reasons to think yes. One is the Silicon Shield. I'll talk about that in a moment. The second is that Taiwan is often referred to, it was first referred to this by Douglas MacArthur, the rather famous and mildly crazy US general from the Second World War, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which basically means that Taiwan is located in an extremely strategic position and more or less controls access to the first and second island chains in the Indo-Pacific. The United States would probably not be in love with the idea of its hegemonic rival gaining control over Taiwan on the basis that Taiwan could then be used by the People's Liberation Army to further project power towards countries like Vietnam or the Philippines, Japan, or even South Korea. And on top of that, the United States has reasons to defend Taiwan on the basis of being generally hawkish on China, as well as caring about the credibility of its alliances. One of the overarching interests that the United States has had for decades in East Asia is deterring nuclear proliferation. The United States knows full well that South Korea and Japan very plausibly would benefit from having independent nuclear arsenals, but nuclear proliferation is generally viewed as a bad thing for the United States within U.S. policymaking circles. So the United States might potentially protect Taiwan in order to assure South Korea and Japan that the United States still has their back and they don't need to get their own nuclear bombs because that would increase the risk of nuclear war. Why might the United States not protect Taiwan? Well, the most obvious reason is that going to war with a nuclear superpower is pretty terrifying and politically risky. And there's the very real prospect that hundreds of American aircraft would be destroyed on the rubble, or sorry, reduced to rubble, that thousands or tens of thousands of Americans could be killed in a war. And on top of that, it's plausible that China deploys tactics that are sufficiently bad as to force Taiwan to capitulate, but not sufficiently bad that the United States feels like it has to get involved. So, for example, there's a often cited proposal for China to blockade as opposed to invade Taiwan. The logic behind a blockade is that Taiwan is an island, so its stockpiles of both gas and oil as well as food would eventually run out, which means that China could more or less starve Taiwan into surrendering control to China. And if the United States isn't willing to intervene, the blockade would more or less stop China from importing anything and therefore would force Taiwanese leadership to more or less surrender or starve. It's not clear if the United States would view a blockade as sufficiently escalatory to trigger a US-China war. The other and most obvious elephant in the room is whether or not Trump specifically would be willing to protect Taiwan against invasion. It's candidly hard to tell. So Trump might be tough on China, though, as we saw in the previous section, it's not entirely clear that he is when China weaponizes its control over rare earths to punish the U.S. It's also possibly the case that Trump could intervene just on the basis that he is surrounded by people who might want him to intervene. It's not clear if that's true, but there are at least some war hawks in the cabinet. Think Marco Rubio, who probably would advocate for a defense of Taiwan. And Trump is also fairly cozy with lots of figures in big tech. Think Mark Andreessen, for instance. And lots of those figures, very plausibly, would want the United States to protect Taiwan due to its dominance in semiconductor manufacturing, which we'll talk about in a second. There's also reasons to believe Trump doesn't care about Taiwan. One reason is that Trump has repeatedly made statements about resenting Taiwan for stealing U.S. chip production. This is kind of a crazy take that doesn't really have much merit for why the United States shouldn't defend Taiwan, but it's potentially a factor in Trumpian psychology. And on top of that, Trump is generally transactional, as we'll talk about more in a bit, and might view a war in Taiwan as not worth the costs. So let's talk a bit about semiconductors. So semiconductors or chips are extremely important in the 21st century economy. They're used in nearly all modern technologies and are particularly important for artificial intelligence and military weapons. For example, if you want to build an advanced missile, you absolutely are going to need advanced semiconductors. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, is what's called a pure play manufacturer, which basically means that TSMC just does manufacturing. They don't do chip design. Firms like NVIDIA or AMD are fabless companies. Fabless means that they're not focused on fabrication of semiconductors, hence fabless. They're focused on designing chips. TSMC is by far the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer. It controls the production of something like 90% of the world's most advanced 3 nanometer semiconductors. And although there are competitors that are rising in places like Japan and the United States and even Europe, as well as China itself, like SMIC, or eventually maybe one day Huawei, none of those competitors are yet capable of challenging TSMC's dominance in advanced chip production. The reason why this is relevant is that TSMC does a huge amount of its manufacturing specifically in Taiwan. which means that Taiwan has huge geopolitical significance for the United States and to some extent for China. The United States has imposed, or at least had previously imposed, sweeping export controls on the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. The logic is that the United States, after the invasion of Ukraine, was concerned that China would weaponize advanced semiconductors in a way that would be problematic for the United States. And in addition, the United States, as well as Europe and Japan, have focused on increasing semiconductor production domestically, such that the United States, Japan, Europe, etc., are not dependent upon Taiwan, which potentially could be subject to a Chinese blockade or invasion for semiconductor imports. The reason that this is relevant, though, is that in the interim, before companies like, for example, Rapidus, which is a Japanese firm, are capable of actually like replicating TSMC production capacity, in the interim period, TSMC being based largely in Taiwan means that Taiwan has huge importance for the United States. Let's talk a bit about Japan and sort of Japan's role in the defense of Taiwan in a hypothetical conflict with China. There's sort of a few things to note about this. The first is that Japan's new prime minister is notably more hawkish than previous Japanese prime ministers, and more recently made a statement that was publicly supportive of Japan using force to protect Taiwan if Taiwanese sovereignty is threatened by China. If you just read statements from Chinese broadcasters and newspapers and diplomats, you'll sort of immediately see just how furious this wolf warrior diplomacy can be when it comes to matters that China views as relating to Chinese sovereignty. So the Chinese consul general in Japan had this horrible line of, quote, if you stick that filthy neck where it doesn't belong, it's going to get sliced off. Are you ready for that? End quote, in response to the Prime Minister of Japan stating that Japan would probably view an attack against Taiwan as threatening Japan's own sovereignty, thereby giving Japanese Self-Defense Forces, or the JSDF, legal authorization to intervene against China in order to protect Taiwan. The reason why that statement, though, is not just an outlier is that there's a broader trend within Japanese politics towards embracing militarization. In particular, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the longtime dominant party in Japanese politics, is increasingly forced to coalition with what's called with the Japan Innovation Party, as opposed to its previous partner. The JIP is notably more hawkish on defense than previous coalition partners. The LDP, by the way, is sort of slipping in the sense that it's lost two of the most recent elections, and its control over the Japanese Diet is waning. And the consequence is that Japan is now shifting increasingly right on defense. There's also a rise of right-wing populist movements like Sanseito, for example, in Japanese politics that are much more vocally supportive of building up Japan's military capability. The other reason Japan matters vis-a-vis Taiwan relates to military bases. So there is a fairly large military base run by the United States called Kadena. It's based in Okinawa, Japan, and it's the closest U.S. air base to Taiwan, and would almost certainly feature very heavily in a war with China. One of the big questions in any war games about U.S., China, Taiwan is whether or not Japan would permit the United States to use U.S. air bases in Japan to operate against China. And the reason is because if the United States is not able to use Japanese bases or U.S. bases on Japanese territory, that would significantly reduce the ability of the U.S. Air Force to contest China's Air Force, and for that matter, China's amphibious landing force and the logistics that supports that landing force in taking control over Taiwan. So that's US China, the Trump shock to the rules-based order and what it might mean for international conflict and globalization. I've spoken quite a lot in the last little bit about the US and China. China will feature a bit less prominently in this next section. The United States will partially factor in, though not as much, and we'll start to pivot a bit more towards European politics and European affairs. Oops, I accidentally stopped screen sharing. That was not what I intended to do. Okay, excellent. I've gotten the screen sharing back up. So, quick warning before talking about Russia-Ukraine. I've written a long set of notes about the historical context for the Russia-Ukraine war, so I'm not going to reiterate most of that historical context. If you're interested in that, I just recommend reading the notes directly. That being said, I do want to start with one sort of overarching comment on history and the role of history in Russia-Ukraine. There's a meta debate about why Putin struck Ukraine back in February 2022, and for that matter, why he took Crimea back in 2014. And the meta debate basically has two potential answers. The first answer is called the NATO expansion hypothesis. If you've ever read John Mearsheimer, who I'm not a particularly large fan of, you'll get his point of view on this one. And the second expansionist theory relates more to Russian culture, language, and identity, and Putin's obsession with restoration of the Soviet Union. The first explanation basically says that NATO, which expanded into Eastern Europe in the late 1990s and early 2000s and continued expanding under the Obama and even Trump 1 administrations, that concerned Russia. The logic is Russia views NATO as a threat to Russian security, and the closer that NATO got to Russia's border, in particular, the closer that NATO got towards Moscow, the more and more anxious Russia got. Russia was concerned, given that NATO had previously issued statements about the possibility of Ukrainian NATO membership. So Russia's concerns about Ukrainian NATO membership prompted Russia to invade Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from gaining NATO membership. The second explanation is not mutually exclusive with the first. It just offers a different account. This argument says Putin has repeatedly spoken about the cultural and linguistic and ethnic ties between Ukrainians and Russians and views the large swaths of Ukraine as rightfully Russian territory. He's openly called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest disaster of the 20th century and probably supports restoration of Russian greatness after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of something like 70 to 75% of Russian territory as the USSR fell apart. And in that way, what Russia really seeks is not ending NATO expansion. There was never any real possibility of Ukraine getting NATO membership. And it's difficult to believe that sensible people inside the Kremlin seriously thought that. And the more sensible explanation instead would be Russia wanted to recapture territory it considers rightfully Russian. Putin wanted to cement his legacy by reestablishing a sort of imperial Russia. And that was the real ultimate source of conflict in Ukraine. And there is historical context that's useful to be aware of for contextualizing these two competing theories. The historical context for that second point, with respect to cultural irredentism and Russian revanchism, is that Putin genuinely does have a distorted conception of Russian history, in which for hundreds, even thousands of years, Russians and Ukrainians have shared a common ancestry and therefore belong to be governed under the same political structure. In terms of the NATO expansion hypothesis, I think there's two pieces of context that are useful to cite if you're interested in making this argument more seriously. One of them is the Soviet experience during the Second World War. The Second World War was unfathomably brutal for the Soviet Union, which sort of began when Germany invaded in June of 1941. The reason why that's relevant for Russia-Ukraine today is not because Putin is correct that Ukraine is run by Nazis. It's rather relevant because one of the lessons that Russia took away from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was the non-aggression pact signed between Hitler and Stalin back in 1939, was that you shouldn't let adversaries come right up to the Russian border because the potential risk of those countries then violating Russian sovereignty is catastrophic and can't be accepted. And that's potentially why people within the Russian security apparatus do care about preventing NATO from getting ever closer towards Russia. Notably, this is, if you were to respond to this argument, you might note NATO already has a military presence along the Russian border. For example, the Baltics are NATO member states. The Baltics also happen to border Russia. So the empirics on this argument are a bit sketchy. The second piece of context that's much more relevant is Kosovo. In 1999, NATO intervened in the Yugoslav war in Kosovo. At the time, Milosevic was in power in Serbia, and the aim was to sort of force Serbian forces to withdraw from Kosovo and stop a potential genocide. Notably, the NATO campaign, unlike the previous campaign that NATO launched in Bosnia in 1995, was not authorized by the United Nations, which meant that NATO was intervening without explicit authorization from the international community, and more importantly, NATO was intervening over Russia's objections. Russia saw this largely as a military operation designed to humiliate Russia because Russia considered Serbia to fall within its historic sphere of influence. And the reason why that matters is to this day, Russian military and political leaders will cite the NATO air campaign in Kosovo as evidence that NATO is an offensive military operation that seeks to topple regimes that it does not support. And that's why, if you're a Russian in theory, you are concerned about NATO expansion. And that's why it is perceived as an existential issue for Russia. And that also helps explain why Russia cares so much about NATO expansion in the ongoing peace negotiations. Brief timeline of the war. I won't go over all of it, but these are the kind of key things to know. The invasion began back in February of 2022. In the first month-ish, about 20% or so of Ukrainian territory was captured. Ukraine's most successful counteroffensive came in the fall of that year when Ukraine liberated Kharkiv and Kherson from Russian occupation. One of the bloodiest battles took place the following spring in Bakhmut when Wagner mercenaries and Russian forces eventually captured the city of Bakhmut. The following month, by the way, is also when Yevgeny Prigozhin staged his fairly famous mutiny. In June of that year, Ukraine launched a failed counteroffensive. Russia launched a counteroffensive, so to speak. In other words, a renewed offensive in the winter of 2024. Well, it began in the fall of 2024 and ultimately captured Avdiivka, a fairly important city in southeastern Ukraine. In August of 2024, Ukraine began what was called the Kursk incursion, which was an unexpected invasion of Russia to capture territory. The logic was not that Ukraine seeks to hold that territory, which has basically been recaptured by Russia. The logic rather was to draw Russian forces away from the front lines in order to give Ukrainians breathing room on the actual front lines in Ukraine. This past June, there was an interesting operation called Spiderweb. It was a large-scale drone attack by Ukraine against strategic Russian aircraft like heavy bombers, which is an interesting example of how drones are transforming the war in Ukraine. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The ongoing battle is chiefly over a city called Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk has been fought over since the summer of 2024. Russia claims to have entered the city. It's still under attack and still being contested by Ukraine. It will probably fall to Russia at some point. The key question is when. It's important to Ukraine as a logistics hub because several highways pass through the city, and Ukraine uses it to move men, material, supplies, ammunition, food, stuff like that. Let's talk about the current state of the war and sort of where Ukraine's defense stands. So that brings us to the more current state of the war and where the trajectory for Russia and Ukraine goes. So the first thing to know about the war is that it's very drone driven. A majority of casualties are now caused by drones as opposed to artillery or missiles, anything of that sort. And the principal reason why Russia has struggled to make deeper advances into Ukrainian territory is Ukraine's quote unquote kill zone. So the kill zone is this long stretch of territory along the front line where it's more or less impossible for Russians to advance without being detected by Ukrainian drones and fairly rapidly dispatched. The reason why this is problematic for Russia is that it makes it nearly impossible for Russia to execute large-scale mechanized assaults. So in other words, you more or less can't parade dozens of tanks and big artillery guns and armored personnel carriers into Ukrainian territory. You have to move, as the Russians, in very small assault groups. And what this means is that most open source intelligence estimates are currently estimating that the casualty ratio is something like 5-1 in Ukraine's favor, which is a pretty monumental edge for Ukraine. Part of the reason for that is that once Russians enter Ukraine's drone kill zone, it's very difficult to evacuate soldiers that get injured. It's estimated that over 1 million Russian casualties have already occurred in the war. There are statements that, like Marco Rubio, for example, the U.S. Secretary of State earlier this year, suggested that something like 150,000 Russians have been killed in 2025 alone. It's not exactly clear if that statement is true, but credible estimates are now that something like 1-ish% of Russia's pre-war male population has died in the war. It's a bit difficult to get good casualty numbers for Ukraine and as well for Russia. For example, one of the ways that you can sort of loosely infer casualty numbers from Russia is to look at budgetary information about payments that Russia makes to families of soldiers who die in combat. But it's not a fantastic way to determine exactly how bloody the war has been for Russia. One of the ways that Russia has tried to deal with the kill zone is to shift towards motorcycle assault groups. So it's pretty common now in drone footage and GoPro footage from the war to see Russians advancing not on tanks, not on APCs, but instead on motorcycles as a way to try to evade detection by Ukrainian drones and sort of move quickly and rapidly. The problem, of course, is that if you can't move in large groups, it's very difficult for Russia to capture a large territory. And also, it's very difficult for Russians to make substantial strides across multiple days, even if you can seize very small amounts of territory. And the consequence of that is, although there's lots of sort of fear mongering about how Ukraine is losing the war and there are all of these advantages stacked against Ukraine's favor, the reality is that the war has gone disastrously for Russia in the sense that in the last 3 years of combat, so more or less since December 2022, Russia has captured something like 1.4-ish% of Ukrainian territory. This year alone, it's been something like 0.6% of Ukrainian territory has fallen into Russian control. No major city has fallen really since the fall of Avdiivka. And even if Pokrovsk is captured, it will have more or less caused more casualties for Russia than Russia experienced in the entirety of the Russian or the Soviet war, rather, in Afghanistan, which spanned an entire decade. Even if Russia were to eventually capture all of the four Ukrainian oblasts that Putin seeks control over, at the current rate of progress, that's going to take until roughly mid-2028, which does not bode well for Russia. So, in that sense, there is a case for optimism on the Ukrainian side of the ledger, which is that Russia's progress has been glacial and been astoundingly costly for Russia's regime, both in terms of lives lost and also in terms of sanctions. There are lots of reasons why sanctions have not had a huge bite on Russia's war economy. One is trade with China. Another is the dramatic increase in Russian war production, which itself has sort of been a fiscal stimulant for the Russian economy. You could sort of characterize Russia's economy as a Kalashnikov economy in which hundreds of thousands of people are employed in the munitions sector. Tons of people are signing up to fight in the war and are being paid directly in that respect. And so sanctions have not been as effective as people want. That being said, this next year is probably going to be the economically hardest year for Russia. Part of the reason for that is almost all of Russia's borrowing has been done domestically with Russian banks, but capital constraints in the Russian financial sector means that's going to become harder and harder over time. Another is inflation. Prices are increasingly rising in Russia. And although Russia experienced a sort of economic boost from building up its war economy, that boost is not permanent because the war sector or the military industrial sector isn't highly productive in the sense that almost all of what's coming out of the war isn't productivity enhancing, right? Vehicles get destroyed, soldiers get killed. There's only so much productivity that can be squeezed out of the war manufacturing sector. And on top of that, the sanctions are having a real bite on particular industries. For example, back in October, Trump imposed a slew of new sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which are two of the largest energy conglomerates inside Russia, both with substantial ties to the oligarchy. The other reason why Ukraine can be optimistic is long-range drone strikes on Russian oil refineries are a very effective form of sanction. The main reason why is refineries are very technologically difficult to rebuild or repair quickly, especially because sanctions limit the inflow of advanced technologies into Russia. The reason that matters is Ukraine has significantly increased the effectiveness of its ranged strike program in the last 18-ish months. Part of that is that Ukraine's drone production is now at very, very high levels. Ukraine is producing something like 600 to 800 drones a day. and it's estimated to be capable of producing 3 million drones a year in the upcoming timeline. And the range of those drones has also improved. And the consequence is that Ukraine can now hit Russian oil refineries pretty reliably, and not just Russian refineries close to the Ukrainian border. Ukraine's been hitting targets thousands of kilometers away. See, for example, Operation Spiderweb back in June. The consequence is Russia's ability to refine crude oil into finished gasoline products is limited. Something like 40% of Russia's refining capacity is now defunct, which means that Russia is losing out on the ability to produce something like 1 million barrels of oil a day, which both causes gas shortages inside Russia. That's why fuel prices are at record highs inside Russia domestically, which also forces Russia to reduce exports in order to avoid a crippling fuel shortage at home. But it also means, on top of that, that Putin just can't make as much money selling oil abroad. The reason is that unrefined petroleum is just less valuable than refined petroleum. So if you can't refine your oil and it has to be refined somewhere else, that's where a lot of the value add comes from. And as a consequence, if you're selling unrefined petroleum, Russia just doesn't make nearly as much money as it would like. The other reason why you might be optimistic is that although Trump is very much pulling back from Ukrainian aid, European states can potentially fill some of the void. A pessimist would say that Europe can't replace important features of US support, like intelligence sharing, for example. But limited European support coupled with Ukraine's military base domestically probably does mean that Ukraine is in the position to continue fighting the war and will not completely be, wiped off the map by Russian advances. You're probably talking about the loss of bits of territory, not entire oblasts. That being said, pessimism is a very reasonable position to hold with respect to the war. The first and obvious challenge for this is Trump. Trump has been wildly inconsistent on Ukraine. Coming into the Oval Office, he was pretty pro-Putin in the sense of berating Zelensky in the Oval Office back in February. There was a temporary pause on intelligence sharing sometime back in March. That changed sometime in August/September after he met in person in Alaska with Putin. He publicly said or suggested that Ukraine could win back all of its territory, imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia's energy sector. He briefly entertained the idea of providing long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Now Trump has sort of seemingly shifted back towards cynicism on Zelensky. Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, reportedly offered and provided specialized coaching to one of Putin's policy advisors on how to sell the Russian peace plan in a way that made it more likely to be accepted. So it's not really clear where Trump stands. Most people probably think he wants a Nobel Peace Prize and probably has some frustrations with both Putin and Zelensky owing to the continuation of the war, a war he promised to end in the first 24 hours of his presidency. There might also be some mercantilism here. Trump wants Ukrainian minerals. That's why he signed a mineral deal earlier in the year. The tangible implication of Trump for Ukraine is a reduction in military aid. It is harder for for Ukraine to fight a war when it doesn't have as many arms and weapons and intermediary goods being supplied to Ukraine. A Ukrainian optimist might say, well, Ukraine can produce its own military technologies. There's some truth to that. The issue is Ukraine can produce the finished goods, but it needs lots of imported intermediate products. Semiconductors would actually be an example. Some of those come from China, lots of those come from the West. And if the West is increasingly unwilling to fund Ukraine's war machine, it's going to be harder and harder for Ukraine to fight the war. The other new challenge is Zelensky. Zelensky early in the war was a huge plus for Ukraine. He was a source of Ukrainian morale and consistent and stable leadership. That has since changed. Back in July, Zelensky very controversially attempted to pass a highly disagreeable law that would more or less neuter and disempower the two major anti-corruption bodies inside Ukraine. It sparked what was sort of briefly called the cardboard revolution against Zelensky. It forced Zelensky to back down and to repeal and avoid the passage of both laws. The more recent controversy that's a much larger issue is one of those corruption bodies recently publicized information about a hugely damaging corruption scandal that affects members of the Ukrainian political elite at really the highest levels. And the reason why that's a problem is, although Zelensky himself has not been personally implicated by the corruption scandal, you still have a huge number of people who are pretty deeply concerned about the quality of Ukrainian governance and the signs that are sent by the fact that some of Zelensky's closest advisors and political allies were deeply corrupt and involved in a $100 million kickback scandal with Ukraine's nuclear energy company. And that means that political support within Ukraine for existing leadership is very much on the decline, and some Western criticisms of Zelensky are sort of on the rise. The next challenge that Ukraine faces relates specifically to the air war. So at this point, there's a series of ways in which the war is being fought. Part of it is along the front lines, but much of the war is now being fought with ranged, sort of like long-range strikes, both drone and missile strikes. Russia has intensified its air campaign. It's something like 27,000 artillery rounds are being fired a day, dozens of missile strikes, hundreds of drone strikes every day. And increasingly, Russia is targeting energy infrastructure deep into the Ukrainian heartland, in Kyiv and even more west. And that means that there are rolling blackouts across Ukraine. Hospitals and schools are struggling to keep the power on. There's major damage to the electricity grid. Power generation is consistently low. And the problem there is that there's no real way for Ukraine to protect itself the longer this war drags on, because it has a major shortage of Western supplied air defense systems. Ukraine can use its own drones to defend against Russian drones, but it can't do much to use Ukrainian drones to protect against Russian missiles. For that, it needs advanced air defense systems provided largely by Western governments. The problem is, although the missile defense systems themselves have already been provided, Ukraine needs to constantly resupply its missile interceptors. The way missile defense works is Russia fires a missile, Ukraine fires a missile at that missile to intercept it in the sky. Ukraine is dramatically short on missile interceptors, which makes it hard for Ukraine to protect its energy infrastructure against Russian strikes. And that's reflected by open source intelligence estimates that show that interception rates have fallen something like at least 10% in 2025 alone. And this is particularly bad in the context of missiles, where something like 50-ish% really of Russia's missiles are not being shot down by Ukrainian defenses. The other advantage that Russia has is manpower. Part of this is for a boring reason, which is just sort of trivially that like Russia has a much larger population compared to Ukraine. And so it's sort of unsurprising as a consequence that Russia has a larger military capability. But the fact that Russian military recruitment remains fairly high, even prior to what will probably be another wave of mandatory military mobilization by Putin this upcoming winter, it's a problem for Ukraine that Russia can just continue to fight the war on a large scale in a way that Ukraine is struggling, especially given that Ukraine soldiers have largely been deployed more or less around the clock since the war began. So fatigue is a very real problem. And it's not just fatigue, but it's also morale, in the sense that desertion rates are up in Ukraine. Lots of soldiers are increasingly struggling with the war effort. Which creates problems for Ukraine's ability to hold territory in the southeast. The other problem that Ukraine faces is financial. So, setting aside concerns relating to soldiers, there's also a real issue here in terms of money, which is Ukraine's economy has been crushed since the war began. And at the same time, Ukraine's government is in a bit of a fiscal pickle, which is to say, it's dramatically increased taxes. It's also dramatically increased defense spending, but it also can't borrow in international credit markets. The IMF projects that won't happen until at least 2027, probably later. The consequence is that Ukraine can't continue to fund the war effort, as well as basic social services in Ukraine proper, without vast quantities of international assistance. The problem is that unless Europe provides billions of, actually hundreds of billions of euros to Ukraine, Ukraine is literally going to run out of money this upcoming spring. European states will probably provide at least some funds. The question is whether or not they'll provide sufficient funds. There's flagging political support in many European countries for aiding Ukraine, both because the war is increasingly futile and many parties' assessment of the war, and also because many of the governments in power, or the governments that will soon be in power in European governments, are particularly skeptical of Ukraine, and in some cases outright pro-Russian. For example, if the National Rally wins in France, or if the Alternative for Germany wins in Germany, there are real concerns about major sources of support for Ukraine more or less falling out. So the relevant question then becomes, if the situation is looking so bad for Ukraine, should Ukraine just outright sue for peace and see what sort of deal that it can get? So this is currently what the war looks like in terms of the front lines. This here is the deep state map as of December 9th in the evening. This is from a couple of days before. You can sort of see where there's an area of contested control and the territory that already falls under Russian dominance. There are competing demands on the Ukrainian and Russian side of peace negotiations. Putin and the Russians want a series of things. Excuse me. One is a ceasefire, but more importantly is Western sanctions relief, demilitarization of Ukraine after the end of the war, an outright prohibition on Ukraine gaining or applying for NATO membership, as well as international recognition of Russian sovereignty over sort of five regions, one being Crimea that was annexed back in 2014, as well as four Ukrainian oblasts, those being Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. Notably, the claim to Donetsk is highly controversial on the Ukrainian side of affairs. The reason is that Donetsk is not fully controlled by Russia in the way that other regions of Ukraine are. The reason that is particularly problematic for Ukraine is that the portion of Donetsk that hasn't yet been captured by the Russians is heavily fortified on the Ukrainian end. It's the so-called fortress belt that runs along the H-20 highway. And that's been something that Ukraine has built up for over a decade now in preparation for a potential Russian invasion that, of course, came in 22. And so if Ukraine abandoned Donetsk, it would force Ukraine to abandon the fortress belt and all of the defensive fortifications that Ukraine built in the region, which would significantly damage Ukraine's ability to protect against a sort of secondary invasion after a peace deal. Lots of people think that's a real possibility. If Putin can get territory and international recognition for territory, he'd probably have lots of reasons to try to push his luck even further. On the Ukrainian end of negotiations, there's a couple of demands. One is a strong opposition to ceding territory to Russia. This is understandable both on moral and geostrategic grounds. On moral grounds, this is Ukrainian territory. Russia has no right to capture it through military force. But also on geopolitical grounds, if Ukraine permits Russia to capture territory, then the precedent that establishes will very much invite Putin to do the same thing again and again and again. And this is the same reason, by the way, that Ukraine has been so reluctant for quite some time, really, to permit any recognition even of Crimea, which is not nearly as consequential or important to Ukraine as the territory that's being fought over today. The related thing that Ukraine wants out of negotiations is a security guarantee. Now, it's probably unlikely that Ukraine ever gets NATO membership, at least not for the foreseeable medium to long-term future. But Ukraine still very much wants a hard guarantee from the West that the West will be there to defend Ukraine against further attack, given that is a very real possibility. Russia's proposal for a security guarantee is a consensus-based system that involves Russia. This is, of course, stupid because if Russia is involved in the peacekeeping deal in Ukraine or has some veto power over the peacekeeping force, then, of course, the peacekeeping force is useless and has no real ability to protect Ukraine against further Russian assault. The reason the security guarantee becomes tricky is Putin and, and Ukraine are seeking very different things in terms of security. On the Russian side of the ledger, if you really believe in the NATO expansion hypothesis, then you logically should expect Russia to be very uncomfortable accepting a permanent Western military installation in Ukraine. But if Ukraine's bare minimum condition for accepting peace is the provision of Western security guarantees, well, those two things seem to be in tension and suggest that peace or a peace deal is borderline impossible. The U.S. role in these proposals is complicated because there are competing factions of the White House and competing attitudes towards Ukraine. So on the one hand, you have figures like J.D. Vance and Witkoff, who are like pretty openly hostile to Ukraine and very skeptical of U.S. military aid to Ukraine on a large scale, and largely just want the conflict to be over. At the same time, there are people in the administration who seem more reasonably level-headed. The main figure in that camp is Marco Rubio, who lots of people had hoped would be a figure that would do more to restrain Trump's stupidest foreign policy instincts, like gutting USAID back in January, or doing a whole host of sort of symbolic shows of diplomacy, like claiming to end conflicts that more or less didn't even exist or hadn't been been active in decades. The issue is it's not clear that the Rubio camp, which recognizes the strategic downfalls of, for example, recognizing Russian sovereignty or providing extensive sanctions relief, it's not clear that that camp really is the camp in a meaningful position of control. The next question that you should ask is, in the event that Ukraine doesn't get a binding security guarantee from the West and a peace deal is signed, is Putin inclined to strike even deeper into Ukraine or even deeper into Europe writ large? Think Poland, think the Baltics. There's a couple of reasons to believe that this is a real risk, setting aside the most obvious one, which is he already went after Ukraine. There's no good reason to believe such a risk-tolerant leader wouldn't try the shot again elsewhere. One reason is outright irredentism. If Putin is pursuing the reunification of ethnic Russians, it's unlikely he'd stop solely at Ukraine. Poland, for example, is a pretty clear next target. Another reason is that Putin probably does want to reassert Russia's sphere of influence in the broader Eastern European region. The distinction between this and irredentism is there are regions that Russia doesn't necessarily have explicit cultural or linguistic ties to, like large parts of Poland, for example. But it would still theoretically be in Putin's interest to capture those areas to create a buffer zone against the West. And that's why, for example, Russia is so keen on supporting the Transnistrian separatist movement, why Russia is so interested in meddling in elections in Moldova and Estonia and so on and so forth. It's to try to it's to try to create a buffer of sorts. The third reason is the Kalashnikov effect I mentioned earlier, which basically is if Russia has spent so much of its money on its munitions sector, there's a real risk that shutting down parts of that munitions sector would be politically risky for Putin. For example, think about the tens of thousands of people who would lose their jobs and how they might react to the Putin regime. What that might mean is once a country has mobilized for total war, it's very difficult to demobilize. And so it might be in Russia's political interest from a regime survivability point of view to start a different conflict in order to keep the war machine churning. A fourth concern is about Russia's ability to continue permanent war across the rest of Europe. He enjoys broad economic support from China in the form of oil sales, but also dual-use goods like technologies, semiconductors, magnets, etc. Iran supplies large numbers of drones and to a lesser extent missiles. That's reduced since the recent war with Israel that I'll talk about later. And North Korea is known to supply both soldiers and artillery shells to Russia. North Korea has a huge quantity of artillery shells and plenty of soldiers as well. Something like 5,000 to 10,000 North Korean soldiers have already suffered casualties in the war. And there's pretty strong evidence that Russia's military production will continue to increase in the long term, even as its economy faces a whole host of issues. The last reason why Putin might potentially press his luck again is the Afghan syndrome. So the Afghan syndrome argument goes basically like this. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a fledgling communist government. Subsequently, the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan for about a decade. It withdrew in 1989. But interestingly, after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Soviet Union faced a pretty major problem with many of the soldiers that had fought in the war. And the problem was that many of those soldiers had a really hard time readjusting on a large scale into Soviet society. And as a consequence, that caused quite a bit of instability for the Soviet regime in the waning years of the Soviet Empire. Putin might have similar concerns about the mobilization of veterans against his regime, or just at bare minimum, the instability that would be created by bringing tens or hundreds of thousands of PTSD-ridden soldiers back into Russian society. So if Russia is keen on pressing its advantage elsewhere, one option might be an outright invasion of, say, Ukraine again, post-peace deal, or another European country, think Poland. But the more likely way that this plays out is what's called gray zone warfare. So the logic of gray zone warfare is military or non-military acts that are escalatory and disruptive, but not sufficiently escalatory, not sufficiently violent, not sufficiently destructive that they would constitute a clear cause for war. So, for example, back in September, and this has continued since then, these were just the ones that got the most coverage and drew the most alarm because they were the beginning of the trend. Russian drones and aircraft penetrated airspace in several NATO members. So, for example, Romania, Estonia, Poland, all in the span of basically a week. At first, people thought, well, maybe this was an accident. It's difficult to see all of this happening in such a short and compressed time frame as an accident. It was almost certainly deliberate. Now, if 19 Russian drones enter Polish airspace, by the way, several of them were then shot down by NATO forces, is that a cause for NATO to declare war on Russia? Probably not. It hasn't happened, obviously. But it is evidence of Russia's ambition to undermine NATO unity and to test NATO's red lines. And this extends Russia's general strategy of gray zone warfare, where rather than outright invade, say, the Baltics, what Russia will do is it will cut deep sea cables in the Baltic Sea to disrupt telecommunications, financial flows, etc. That's not an act of war per se, but is very much a provocation. Similar deals would be cyber attacks against electric grids or electoral systems, assassinations of foreign dissidents, including through the use of chemical agents, disinformation campaigns where you try to stir up misinformation in elections and back particular candidates, the funding of separatist movements like Transnistria. Notably, one example where Russian gray zone warfare hasn't worked was the recent suite of elections in Moldova. The Russian government spent conservatively something like 100 million euros trying to back a pro-Russian party that included outright vote buying and cyber attacks. Nonetheless, the pro-European party actually ended up winning, which is a fairly major failure of Russia's gray zone warfare in Moldova. Now, the issue for gray zone warfare vis-a-vis NATO is that responding to gray zone warfare is complicated. And the reason it's complicated is that if you over-respond, you risk escalation. And no one wants that against a nuclear power. If you under-respond, you risk appeasement. Think Neville Chamberlain back in the 30s. So, for example, NATO's response to recent aerial incursions by Russian aircraft into NATO airspace has been what's called Operation Eastern Sentry, which is to sort of beef up NATO's presence in Eastern Europe. It's not clear if that's a sufficiently calibrated response. It's probably not strong enough for Putin to feel confident, for example, that he hasn't undermined NATO unity. Or that this hasn't caused increased consternation in European governments about the potential for war with Russia. And this, by the way, is not a trend that began in the last year or even 2 years. You can look back for more or less a decade, even longer, arguably, to find cases where Russian assets and Russian operatives have done a whole range of things to disrupt water systems and transportation systems, planes, a whole range of Western countries have been subject, and for that matter, Central Asian countries as well have been subject to Russian meddling. So that's the scene with Russia and Ukraine, the state of peace, and the potential risks of a bad deal. Now we'll pivot towards the Middle East with a particular focus on Gaza, Iran, Saudi, and Syria. So I'll sort of start with context pre-10/7. There's this kind of odd outcome where Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor, somewhat famously wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that was published online on October 2nd, 2023, and was sent out in the print edition later that week, in which the article written by Sullivan wrote, quote, although the Middle East remains beset with perennial challenges, the region is far quieter than it has been for decades. That, of course, aged awfully and began sort of 5 days later with October 7. And so it's worth noting just how fundamental the transformation of the Middle East has been in the last 2.5 years. In Gaza, you had the October 7 Hamas attack, followed by the Israeli war in and siege of Gaza, causing huge Palestinian suffering, a genocide, as well as escalatory violence in the West Bank. Outside of just Gaza, there's been Israeli wars in Lebanon and to a lesser extent in Yemen, leading to significant degradation of the military capabilities of not only Hamas, which operates in Gaza, but also Hezbollah, the Lebanese sort of political party / militant organization, as well as the Houthis, which occupy large swaths of southern Yemen, despite the previous ceasefire in Yemen that took hold in 2022. Houthis in Yemen have also been going on the offensive, beginning roughly in sort of November, December of 2023. The Houthis began launching drone strikes against commercial ships that passed through and transited through the Red Sea. That's had huge effects on global shipping, as lots of companies increasingly avoid the Red Sea, and also prompted both Biden and now Trump to intervene militarily against Houthi targets via airstrikes. Even outside of Israel's actions in the Middle East, Syria saw the collapse of a 50-year-long dictatorship when Bashar al-Assad fled from Damascus. And gave rise to a transitional government led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Ahmed al-Shara. Although that government has faced large problems with sectarian violence, CF the March violence in Latakia and the July violence in Suwaida. Israeli airstrikes against Iran last June led to the most overt confrontation between Israel and Iran in their recent last sort of 40-year history, and ultimately saw the United States deploy B-2 bombers and bunker busters to strike 3 nuclear sites in Iran to set back Iran's nuclear program by some amount of time. And the more recent act coming in September of 2025 was an unexpected Israeli strike against Hamas diplomats in Qatar, which outraged the United States sort of behind the scenes, pushed Israel to accept a peace deal in Gaza, prompted Saudi Arabia to sign a security deal with Pakistan, and then later to sign a sort of upgraded defense pact with the United States. So the point, and this isn't even like, other events that have gone on in the Middle East more broadly, like, for example, the recent violence between Pakistan and Afghanistan, tensions between Iran and Afghanistan, a whole range of other outcomes in Iraq specifically. You could sort of go through nearly every country in the Middle East and identify the ways in which its politics and international outcomes have changed in the last 2 years. So let's walk through a couple of these changes individually. The first and the most obvious shift in Middle Eastern relations in the last sort of 2-ish years has been Gaza. So October 7th was the original impetus when Hamas struck Israel, killed roughly 1,200 Israelis, and took around 150 or so. I think that's like 250. That's a typo. Sorry. 250 or so Israelis hostage and took them back into Gaza. Israel subsequently began a war in Gaza, as well as an intensified blockade and siege of Gaza. The objectives stated by the Netanyahu government were first, the destruction of Hamas as a military entity, second, the destruction of Hamas as a political entity, and third, the return of hostages to Israel. In the span of the war that lasted, it's a little difficult to say that the war is over. We'll talk about the peace deal in just a moment. But most estimates have at least 70,000 Palestinians having been killed by the war. Huge numbers of people are at risk and have been historically at risk. Food insecurity, largely as a consequence of Israel's weaponization of food inflows into Gaza. And in addition, most of the casualties in Gaza, which are probably underreported, are civilian casualties. We'll talk about Netanyahu's cabinet in a moment, so I'll return back to that last point there. The more recent update vis-a-vis Gaza was the Trump-backed peace plan for Gaza. So a bit of context is Netanyahu's willingness to end the war has always been in doubt, and there are sort of 2 reasons for this. One reason is Netanyahu's cabinet relies on the support of hard-right parties that are reluctant and have previously been very reluctant to end the war unless absolute victory is acquired. It's worth noting, by the way, that those parties have largely, or at least to a substantial degree, characterized the ceasefire as a victory for Israel by not entirely acknowledging it or characterizing it as a ceasefire. It's to some extent more so thought of as a stepping stone of sorts for Israel to continue the degradation of Hamas. But in terms of Netanyahu specifically, the concern that Netanyahu has is if the cabinet collapses, or more specifically, if the government collapses, because hard and far-right Israeli ultra-Zionist parties withdraw their support from his cabinet, the main concern then is that Netanyahu's government collapses prior to next October's elections, or scheduled elections. The risk for Netanyahu is that he faces a series of corruption charges that potentially could land him in prison. He has since asked for a pardon. It's unclear if he'll get one. Trump also endorsed the pardon request. The relevance, though, is that keeping the war ongoing might be a way, or has historically in the last 2 years been a way for Netanyahu to keep his government intact, and in doing so, potentially stay out of, or at least delay, legal trouble. The second concern vis-a-vis Netanyahu is Trump. So Trump sort of had two motives, at least, for pressuring Israel into the peace deal, which by all accounts Israel was not otherwise interested in. In fact, the impetus for the September strike on Qatar seemingly was to nosedive further prospects for peace talks by killing Hamas's diplomatic team, which was not entirely successful. The Trump factor, though, has sort of two components. One component for Trump is the Nobel Peace Prize crusade. He's very intent, evidently, on winning the Nobel Peace Prize. The other part is the September 9th Israeli strike on Qatar really did irk the United States. The reason why is that Qatar is a non-major but still U.S. ally. And Israel unilaterally striking Qatar without U.S. authorization was a major slight to the United States, and also caused the United States concern about how other countries in the region will think about U.S. security guarantees. Even though Qatar is not explicitly a recipient of one, it does host U.S. military bases. Those two factors led the United States to pressure Israel into accepting the 20-point peace deal, which sort of calls for a three-stage approach to long-term peace in Gaza. We're currently, as of mid-December and the first, it's TBD whether or not the peace deal will collapse before reaching stage 2 and eventually stage 3. The first phase of the ceasefire calls for an immediate end to hostilities, increased aid inflows, and hundreds of trucks entering Gaza every day with humanitarian aid, assistance, food, water, medicine, etc., as well as the return of hostages, which has already been complete, with the exception of, I think, one body remains unaccounted for, as well as Israel releasing Palestinian prisoners back into the Palestinian territories on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as the partial withdrawal of Israeli forces. So over here on the left-hand side, you can sort of see the proposed line that Israeli forces have drawn back to. The second phase of the ceasefire is the one that's probably much trickier. It involves Hamas demilitarizing, so Hamas putting down its weapons, and the implementation of what's called an ISF, International Stabilization Force. That's an internationally backed, internationally trained, internationally funded peacekeeping force that's intended both to serve as a sort of interim guarantor of stability in Gaza, as well as to train the sort of next generation police establishment in Gaza to maintain peace long term. The third phase calls for the institution of a technocratic Palestinian government led by the quote unquote Board of Peace that will also personally involve Trump. That potentially involves the Palestinian Authority, which operates in the West Bank, or the PA, being given some influence or power. But that requires substantial reform of the Palestinian Authority, which both is viewed skeptically by many Palestinians on the basis of sort of organizational incompetence and corruption, as well as viewed skeptically by Israel on the basis of its inability to govern. This then would result in a technocratic PA-led government, which then benefits from Arab-led reconstruction efforts. For example, there is a proposal from Egypt for Arab states to finance the reconstruction of Gaza, to clean the rubble out of Gaza, to build new infrastructure, to pave new roads, so on and so forth. It's worth noting already the ceasefire is very fragile. There have been accusations both by Hamas and by Israel of the ceasefire having been violated on both sides. Several hundred Palestinians have already been killed. Several Israeli soldiers have already been killed, even since the ceasefire took effect, and airstrikes do continue to a lesser extent than during the heart of the conflict. So the ceasefire is not a pure ceasefire in the sense that the fire has not fully ceased. The main questions moving forward are, first, will Hamas agree to demilitarize? This is arguably the most immediate question because it determines whether or not phase 2 of the ceasefire goes into effect. The key question here is most Israeli members of the current government probably would back or could theoretically back resumption of Israeli operations in Gaza if Hamas refuses to demilitarize. This could potentially give cover for Netanyahu to relitigate the war. In addition, if Hamas doesn't demilitarize, it also complicates plans for an international peacekeeping force. It's hard to envision countries providing large numbers of soldiers, for instance, or police officers to operate in Gaza if they have to confront the possibility of violent shootouts with Hamas militants. The other reason it's problematic is that it would complicate Arab investment into Gaza. For example, it's less likely that countries like Qatar, the UAE, or Saudi Arabia would invest billions of dollars into Gaza's reconstruction and clearing of the rubble in the event that there is the risk of, continued violence on the ground. The flip side of the Hamas demilitarization concern is whether or not the Israeli government withdraws and honors the peace deal. There are very real concerns that Netanyahu's government will torpedo the deal or will find ways to remain militarily involved in Gaza. For example, refusing to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, which is a very narrow stretch of territory inside Gaza that the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, is very keen on remaining in. The resulting consequence of all of this is, given the vast concerns both about Hamas demilitarization and Israel's willingness to honor the peace deal. There are immediate concerns about whether or not the peace deal even reaches, for example, the institution of the ISF or reconstruction. Even if that condition is satisfied, there is still then a whole bunch of concerns, like whether or not Arab investment into reconstruction is adequate. Egypt's plan focuses on sort of 2 to 3 phases of reconstruction. The first involves clearing rubble and then turning that rubble sort of into the new streets this is something that's been done in the past in other cases, but turning rubble into new roads and then building new infrastructure, and then later on building more housing. A majority of Palestinians now have been displaced from their homes. There's a map up early on this previous one showing damage to buildings within the Gaza Strip, as well as a chronic shortage of tents, as well as a consequence of Israeli limitations. And there are concerns about whether or not investment is sufficient to enable the reconstruction of Gaza. Egypt's proposed plan costs roughly 50-ish billion. The UN estimates that the actual number that's needed is probably closer to 70 billion. It's difficult to envision investment being sufficient to reach either of those numbers. The other concern relates to whether or not there's sufficient international support for the ISF, whether or not the PA is capable of reforming sufficient to govern, and whether or not violence in the West Bank will decrease in the long run, or whether Israel might outright attempt to annex the West Bank in defiance of international law. The Trump administration has publicly opposed Israeli annexation of the West Bank, but hard-right parties will probably view this a bit differently. That in part depends on how far-right parties like the Jewish Power Party fare in Israel's late 2026 elections. So let's now pivot towards the Israel-Iran dyad. So just a bit of context here. The modern Iranian government came to power in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Islamic Revolution. It goes by different names, and what name you call it largely depends on who you're speaking to. But this was when Khomeini assumes power and instituted a 12er Shiite government. Today, the Grand Ayatollah is the sort of official grand leader of Iran. That's Ali Khamenei. He is 86 years old. He is partially paralyzed. He is quite ill. Most people suspect that he'll be succeeded in the next few years. It's unclear who his successor will be. There, for several years, were rumors that Mojtaba Khamenei, his direct descendant, would accede to the position. Allegedly, Khamenei had put together or has put together a list of potential successors, and Mojtaba is not on the list. So it's a bit unclear on who the next supreme leader is likely to be. The supreme leader, in theory, has maximal influence in both Iran's civil and spiritual and military leadership. The reality is a bit more complicated. So in theory, there are multiple factions of the Iranian government. So on the one hand, you have the Grand Ayatollah. There's also the Guardian Council, which vets candidates for elections. There's a democratically elected component of Iran's government. For example, the current president of Iran, who was elected back in 2024, is relatively moderate in comparison to previously elected presidents. But in addition to that, there's substantial influence given to appointees of the Grand Ayatollah. There are then two components to Iran's military. There's Artesh, which is the conventional military, and there's the IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC, until June, was probably without much controversy, the most powerful organization within Iranian society, in terms of control over the economy, in terms of control over policymaking, and especially in terms of control over foreign policy. The reason why the IRGC was so influential was, first, the reinstitution of sanctions on Iran back in 2018, when Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, gave huge influence to the IRGC. The reason is that the IRGC is involved in running a ton of Iran's corporations, and in particular, large amounts of the smuggling rackets that allow Iran to evade international sanctions. So the IRGC either directly or indirectly controls a huge fraction of Iran's economic activity. The other reason for this is that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps more or less dictates Iran's foreign policy. It is the IRGC that funds regional militias like Hamas and Hezbollah. It is the IRGC that has historically run the nuclear weapons program. And domestically, it's the IRGC that's responsible for the suppression of opposition to the regime. They run, for example, what's called the Basij paramilitary forces, which has sort of historically been responsible for the enforcement of Sharia law, morality codes, for example, relating to veiling requirements, and cracking down on opposition. Most famously, in 2009, when the Green Movement arose in response to election rigging, and also after the Masa Amini protests back in the fall of 2022, after the death of a young woman, Masa Amini. That means that the IRGC, certainly until June, was the most powerful faction of the Iranian government. That means that's important for assessing Iranian governance, because the IRGC is relatively hardline in the sense that it is more supportive of hard projection of Iranian power, the development of a strong military, skepticism of cooperating with the West, and so on and so forth. That being said, it's a bit difficult to determine where the IRGC stands post-June. We'll talk about the Israeli strikes from June, but much of Israel's strikes in June of 2025 targeted IRGC leadership, IRGC infrastructure, as well as the sort of core bases of the IRGC's power. For example, its ballistic missile inventory, its nuclear weapons program, and the three major proxies of the IRGC, being Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And that means that collectively the IRGC's regional influence has certainly taken a real hit in the last 2 years, especially after the fall of Assad, who was a Iranian ally in Syria as the dictator of Syria, who has since been replaced by a government that is oppositional to, or at least comparatively more oppositional to, Iran. It's difficult to determine whether or not that means that the IRGC has lost influence. At the same time, the IRGC remains the most powerful faction of the Iranian government. In particular, Ali Khamenei spent almost all of the June conflict with Israel holed up, largely isolated in a bunker. There's pretty good reason to believe that if he had any power over the IRGC, it has since been largely taken away, because the IRGC was more or less calling all of the shots back in June. So let's talk next about Iran's nuclear weapons program and how it relates to Iran's national security strategy. So Iran fought the Islamic Revolution against the Shahdom back in 1979 and assumed power at the end of that year. Subsequently, Iraq invaded Iran in 1980. That sparked the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq War. And coming out of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran developed sort of a three-pronged approach to deterrence of future conflict, given that Iran was operating in a region swarming with countries that hated Iran and saw its destruction. The first, so for example, Ba'athist Iraq under Saddam Hussein was opposed to Iran, as was, and until recently, Saudi Arabia, and of course Israel, which views Iran as an existential threat, and vice versa. So the three strategies of Iran's deterrence were A, the what's called nuclear hedging, which I'll chat about in a moment. Second, the construction of a vast arsenal of missiles and more recently drones, in particular ballistic missiles that could penetrate Israeli air defenses. And third, the development of proxy militias. The logic behind these proxy militias, or the so-called axis of resistance, is Iran would fund and train and arm groups like Hezbollah and Hamas as a way to deter Iran's regional adversaries from taking action directly against Iran. For example, if Saudi Arabia or Israel tried to be aggressive against Iran, Iran could order its proxies to target, say, Saudi Arabia or Israel, as has happened in the last 2 to 3 decades. For example, with Houthi strikes against Saudi Arabia and with obviously Hamas, but also Hezbollah strikes against Israel. For example, after 10/7, Hezbollah began firing rockets into large portions of Iran. Into Israel, excuse me. Bad misspeak. So the three strategies that Iran pursued collectively ensured Iranian defense. Nuclear hedging is the least easy to understand. So the logic of nuclear hedging is lots of people will argue about whether or not Iran was seriously pursuing a nuclear weapon. Probably the most objective answer is Iran's strategy, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years, was to hedge as to whether or not Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon. The logic goes basically like this. If you convince everyone else that you could theoretically get a nuclear weapon, but you don't actually have a nuclear weapon just yet, you get most of the benefits, at least in theory, of nuclear deterrence, but none of the actual costs of building and maintaining and possessing a nuclear arsenal. The logic is no one's going to attack you because they know that theoretically, once some other country attacks you, you'll then respond by racing to build a nuclear bomb, getting it in 6 to 8 weeks, and then using it against them. So the logic of nuclear hedging basically is that if you appear to have the ability to nuclearize, you sort of are partially covered by the logic of nuclear deterrence. That's the logic of nuclear hedging. So under that logic, Iran began its nuclear weapons program back sometime in the 80s or 90s. It was called Project Ahmad. That ended in 2003, probably as a consequence of the United States being directly adjacent to Iran, both because the U.S. invaded Iraq and because the United States occupied Afghanistan. Nuclear weapons related research continued, but not nearly at the same pace or with as many military applications. It escalated at some point. Prior to 2003. It came more towards a stop then and resumed subsequently. The United States led a coalition to impose sanctions on Iran for its illegal enrichment of uranium. That subsequently led to years-long negotiations that resulted in the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the worst acronym ever. The JCPOA was a nuclear deal between the P5+1, so the U.S., Britain, Russia, France, China, and Germany, as well as Iran. And the deal basically was Iran agrees to limit its enrichment of uranium, and agrees for the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor Iran's nuclear energy sites. And in exchange, the P5+1 countries will give sanctions relief to Iran. That was the deal. In 2018, Trump withdrew from the deal. He claimed that Iran was in violation. It probably wasn't, although subsequently, after the withdrawal, it did violate the terms of the JCPOA. That's sort of universally agreed upon now. The important implication of Trump's withdrawal was the imposition first of dollarized sanctions on Iran that more or less cut Iran off from use of the dollar. And secondly was secondary sanctions. So primary sanctions would be the United States says we will no longer trade with Iran. Secondary sanctions means we will not trade with anyone that trades with Iran. So the logic, that's a little bit oversimplified, but the TLDR is that secondary sanctions are extremely potent because they more or less cripple access to international trade and international finance. So in 2018, the United States imposed secondary sanctions on Iran that continued under the Biden administration. This led Iran to expedite its nuclear weapons research. By May of 2025, Iran had enriched something like 400 kilograms of uranium to 60% purity. So, for context, most uranium that is naturally recurring is U-238. But in order to build a nuclear weapon, you need a specific isotope of uranium called U-235. And the way that you do this basically is you take uranium, you put it in a centrifuge, which spins it around a bunch, and it separates out the uranium by mass. And so you separate out the lighter U-235 from the heavier U-238. In order to build a bomb, you need 90% enriched uranium. So 90% of the uranium that you have is the correct isotope. But Iran was not there. Iran was around 60% enrichment. That's probably consistent with a hedging strategy, which is to say 60% enrichment is sufficient for countries to be worried that Iran could get the bomb, but Iran doesn't yet have the bomb, obviously. And 400 kilograms is a large enough quantity that it's difficult to destroy all at once. The Israeli government has always been opposed to the development of nuclear weapons in Iran. This relates to what's called the Begin Doctrine, which has been in place since the early 1980s. The logic is that Israel will take preemptive military action against regional adversaries pursuing nuclear weapons. This most famously resulted in an airstrike against a nuclear reactor in Iraq back in 1981, as well as a smaller scale operation against a Syrian nuclear reactor back in 2007. Israel has also extended this doctrine to apply to Iran previously. The most famous examples of these were assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, often through car bombings, as well as the rather famous Stuxnet cyber attack, which was a sort of, although it's never been officially confirmed, almost certainly was a US and Israeli program to infect Iran's centrifuges with malware that caused them to sort of self-destruct, more or less. So that's the context on Israel's opposition to Iran's nuclear weapons program. The logic is that Israel believes that if Iran comes into possession of a nuclear weapon, it would potentially use nuclear weapons to destroy Israel. And as a consequence, Israel doesn't view Iran's nuclear weapons program as compatible with Israeli sovereignty, and therefore Israel will do nearly anything to prevent that from happening. Now, historically, Israel had avoided direct military strikes against Iran. And the principal reason for this both was the sophistication of Iran's ballistic missile program, and more importantly, the strength of its axis of resistance. Again, that's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as well as a smorgasbord of other smaller militias, particularly based in Iraq after the end of the U.S. involvement in the Iraq War. The problem for Iran was that over the course of 2 to 3 years, Israel systematically weakened the power of each major Iranian proxy. A good example of this would be the Israeli military strikes against Lebanon, as well as the rather famous pager attacks against Hezbollah, where Israel infected or sort of intervened at some point in Hezbollah's supply chain to place small explosives within the pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah soldiers and commanders, and then detonated them simultaneously back in September 2024 to deal damage to Hezbollah's leadership structures. So by the time that Israel was considering taking action against Iran's nuclear weapons program militarily, the major tool of deterrence historically available to Iran, which is to say the axis of resistance threatening to retaliate against Israel, had sort of lost much of its influence. The other concern for Iran was that previously, Israel knew that military strikes against Iran would not do all that much good because Iran had a fairly impressive air defense system. But on two separate occasions, first in April of 24 and then in October of 2024, Iran and Israel had brief missile exchanges, not large enough to deal real damage to either country, but large enough that Israel was able to degrade some of the most advanced Russian-supplied S-300 missile defense systems in Iran. The consequence was that Iran's ability to defend against future Israeli attacks was badly weakened, and that was further the case after December 2024. Syria had historically been an ally of Iran, and Iran used Syria as a land bridge to sort of funnel weapons and funds from Iran through Syria into places like Yemen. And the collapse of the Syrian government and the rise of an oppositional force basically meant that Iran lost access to Syria as a reliable corridor for backing the axis of resistance. And even more importantly, one of the first things that Israel did after the collapse of the Assad regime was to more or less destroy all of the Syrian air force, which basically made it impossible for Syria to defend against Israeli fighter pilots and jets and bombers, which meant that Israel could more or less operate in Syrian airspace without interdiction, which meant that Israel could get much closer towards Iran's territory without having concerns about its aerial refuelers being destroyed by Iranian or Syrian airstrikes. That's the context on the sort of Israel-Iran strikes from this June. Then in June, Israel launched what was called Operation Rising Lion. There were sort of four principal targets, namely A, nuclear targets as well as nuclear leadership. Second, elimination of Iran's military and scientific leadership. Third was the destruction of air defenses. And fourth was destroying Iran's ballistic missiles and missile launchers. The retaliation from Iran was a series of drone and missile strikes against Israel when the United States intervened in what was called Midnight Hammer, which was an operation where the United States deployed long-range strategic bombers to hit a very heavily fortified target at Fordo with what are called bunker busters or GBU-57s. After that, Iran had a sort of performative retaliation where it fired a small number of missiles at a U.S. airbase in Qatar, but probably gave advance notice to the United States about the strike to prevent any U.S. casualties, which in turn could risk further U.S. conflagration in the conflict, which would probably not be in Iran's best interest. By the end of the conflict, it was brought to an end after 12 days. Iran has been badly weakened militarily. It probably is the case that the Iranian government, and in particular the IRGC, at some point seeks retribution. Notably, Iran's tone more recently has been fairly moderate. Iran has openly suggested it's open, for example, to working on and negotiating a new nuclear deal with the United States and with the P5+1 countries. Iran has attempted to tone down some of its military responses. For example, the retaliation against the United States back in June was fairly mute. And this does suggest that Iran's government at this point prioritizes regime survival above all else and recognizes the precariousness of the current moment. The Iranian economy, largely separate from the June conflict, has been badly battered by combinations as well as the IRGC's corruption. For example, inflation rates are well over 40% and gas shortages are widespread across most of Iran. And it's not clear that Khamenei is a particularly effective leader, nor is there clarity on who comes next and whether there will be a power struggle to determine who his successor might be. Eventually, Iran will probably seek retaliation. The question is the nature of the retaliation. Will it be a direct strike on Israel? The other question is whether or not Iran's nuclear weapons program remains viable. The most likely answer is that Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions have been set back by several months, possibly years. But the big issue for Israel and the United States is that it's not clear at all that Israel's airstrikes actually destroyed all of Iran's enriched uranium or buried it sufficiently deep under rubble. Iran claims that's the case because Iran's claiming it doesn't pose a threat, i.e. to avoid further strikes. But it's possibly the case that some of that 60% enriched uranium remains, in which case Iran still has some pathway to building a nuclear weapon. It's just been slowed rather substantially. So all of this should sort of contextualize just how dramatically the situation with respect to Israel, Gaza, and Iran has changed in the last 2 years. We'll now sort of pivot towards talking about two other domains within the Middle East that have been, to a lesser extent, affected by Israel, but have experienced their own set of changes. One in Saudi Arabia, the other in Syria. In terms of Saudi Arabia, bare bones context that you probably should be familiar with is that Saudi Arabia is a absolute monarchy. Its monarchy and the ruling house of Saud practices a particular sect of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism. That sort of arose in the 1800s. Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, is the de facto leader, even though he's not the king. He has embarked on a fairly unexpectedly reformist agenda. For example, women are now permitted to drive in Saudi Arabia. Male guardianship laws have been fairly substantially relaxed. And there's a real shift to liberalize the country in some domains. For example, the partial sale of alcohol the legalization of more jobs, opportunities for women. Something like 30% of all employees in Saudi Arabia now are female. And all of this is an attempt both to appeal towards young Saudis, who comprise something like a half to two-thirds of Saudi-born citizens, but also Westerners who might travel to Saudi Arabia as tourists or even as employees. That being said, you shouldn't think that MBS is a Democrat. There's liberalization without democratization in the sense that MBS has consolidated power. The most famous example of this were the Ritz-Carlton purges. They didn't involve Ritz-Carlton in the sense of purging the hotel, but rather Mohammed bin Salman rounded up hundreds of political opponents in the regime or individuals who were insufficiently loyal or allegedly corrupt, seized their assets and often imprisoned. Or ousted them from power. They just happened to be housed at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. It's very ritzy. So that's sort of why it got that particular name. So MBS is not per se seeking to democratize Saudi Arabia by any means, but there is very much an attempt to open Saudi Arabia up in order to appeal towards its youth population and, more importantly, to bring Saudi Arabia sort of into the international scene to a greater degree. The economic version of MBS's reforms is called Vision 2030. The logic of Vision 2030 is to reduce Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil. Most of Saudi's oil production is controlled by the state-owned or mostly state-owned firm called Saudi Aramco. It is a very small share of it that was issued in an IPO a few years back. The logic behind Vision 2030 is that Saudi's oil is exhaustible. It'll eventually be depleted. And more importantly, reliance on oil is politically risky. For example, back in 2014, oil prices collapsed, and that caused real political problems for the ruling monarchy at the time. When oil prices go down, petrostates struggle to finance the vast patronage projects that allow, or patronage networks, excuse me, that allow the incumbents to retain power. And so for that reason, Saudi Arabia has invested vast sums of money into diversifying its economy towards things like artificial intelligence, excuse me, data centers, but also attracting a huge number of new industries like video games. Like Saudi Arabia is now the largest owner in EA, as well as professional sports. So, for example, Saudi now runs its own football league. It owns Live Golf. It owns a whole host of international sports teams, including in Europe. It's building an entire new mega project, an entire new city, more or less all to transition the country into a modern, advanced, high-tech economy. In terms of international relations, though, there's a couple of things that are worth noting about Saudi Arabia. The first is Saudi Arabia's security posture. So historically, Saudi Arabia and Iran have been fierce adversaries. Nominally, this is split along sectarian lines. Saudi is a majority Sunni country. Iran is a majority Shia country. But the dispute is not fundamentally religious in the sense that the underlying reasons for the Saudi-Iran rivalry have much more to do with ambitions for power than disputes over the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad. That tension has deteriorated. Bad word, sorry, I meant it in the opposite way. Tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran have become less bad in the last 2 to 3 years for sort of two reasons. One reason is back in 2023, China mediated a normalization of ties between Saudi and Iran. To be clear, normalization doesn't mean they're allies. It just means that they restored recognition and diplomatic engagement after having previously broken that off. The second reason is that Mohammed bin Salman, when he first gained power back in the mid-2010s, had a much more assertive foreign policy posture in terms of military force. In particular, Saudi Arabia used vast military power, largely provided to it by U.S. arms sales, to strike the Houthis, which were backed by Iran in Yemen. That caused huge civilian casualties, mass famine, and had real outcry on the international stage against Saudi Arabia. When Biden assumed power in 2021, there was a temporary suspension of some arms sales to Saudi Arabia, specifically linked to the Saudi air campaign in Yemen. Importantly, Mohammed bin Salman has seemingly since pivoted and is much more interested now in sort of building a fragile peace and avoiding direct conflict with Iran. And the reason why that's relevant vis-a-vis Mohammed bin Salman is a general change in his attitude towards foreign policy in the last sort of several-ish years. This is also reflect. This is a nice quote from the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, that this also sort of extends to like MBS's willingness to cooperate with contemporary Syrian leadership as opposed to stick to hardline ideology or the imposition of military force. So that's partially why the Saudi-Iran conflict has ameliorated in sort of recent years. At the same time, Saudi Arabia nonetheless exists in a region that is very much volatile and prone to violence. There are concerns that the Houthis might eventually turn their rockets back on Saudi Arabia. Part of the reason for this is that the Houthis are facing a major financial crisis, partially due to sanctions and partially due to corruption and endemic mismanagement in Houthi-governed Yemen. And as the conflict with Israel winds down, it's possible that the Houthis turn their focus towards Riyadh. That is concerning for Saudi Arabia, as was the Israeli strike on Qatar, because it raises the question of whether or not U.S. allies in the region are even safe against Israel, which commands such influence over U.S. foreign policy, partially through AIPAC and partially through the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. In any case, Saudi Arabia sees all of these security threats and has sort of taken two steps to deal with them. One was the signing of a defense treaty with Pakistan back in September, which theoretically means that Saudi Arabia is now covered by Pakistan's nuclear umbrella. The other and the much more substantial development was Trump's meeting with Mohammed bin Salman back in November, which permitted the sale of fifth-generation F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia and a whole slew of other areas that are relevant for Saudi Arabia's economic development, including, most notably, civilian nuclear cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the United States. The reason why all of this is interesting is twofold. One is it suggests that Trump is not at all bothered by previous concerns the United States has had with Saudi, like human rights abuses in Yemen, the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed largely on MBS's orders, despite being an American journalist, and as well as concerns that the United States intelligence community has about potential info leakage of F-35 designs from Saudi Arabia to China. The more interesting implication, though, relates to Israel. So historically, in fact, just prior to 10/7, the U.S. aim was to give Saudi Arabia much of what it just gave Saudi Arabia, including F-35s, civilian nuclear cooperation, and more importantly, a explicit and binding defense guarantee from the United States. And the United States theoretically planned to conditionalize all of this on Saudi-Israeli normalization, much like the Abraham Accords back in 2020. Interestingly, Trump has just given up lots of leverage in the form of the civilian nuclear plans and F-35s to Saudi Arabia without the requirement of Saudi Arabia normalizing ties with Israel. The binding defense guarantee has not yet been provided. That might come down sometime down in the future, but it is worth noting the forfeiture of leverage in that context. The last thing I'll talk about in the context of the Middle East is Syria and the sort of regional dynamics that get implicated from Syria. So, brief context on the Syrian civil war. The Assad dictatorship governed Syria almost continuously since the late 60s, early 70s, and was responsible for the majority of deaths during the Syrian civil war, which broke out in 2011 amidst the Arab Spring, which was a series of protests that swept across the Middle East and North Africa, started in December in 2010 when a Tunisian street vendor lit himself on fire in protest of the regime's corruption and brutality that eventually led to widespread revolutions, most of them peaceful, some of them violent in places like Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, which toppled Mubarak's regime, led briefly to a democratic government, and then subsequently military rule under el-Sisi. In addition, there were movements in Yemen that ultimately led to the Yemeni civil war. There were limited protest movements, though not on a large scale, in Saudi Arabia. And of course, mass protests in Syria that began in March 2011. A young boy spray-painted anti-regime graffiti. He was subsequently tortured, imprisoned, nearly killed. That sparked mass protests. Assad cracked down. Parts of the military defected to form the Free Syrian Army. The conflict subsequently spiraled and ended in 2024 with around 600,000 people having lost their lives and millions of people having been displaced largely into the surrounding region. The end of the conflict was highly unexpected. The By the time of the rebel offensive that ousted Assad, most people had assumed the conflict was functionally a frozen conflict. The main reason is back in 2020, March 2020 specifically, Turkey and Russia mediated a ceasefire that more or less froze the conflict with several major groups involved. Most people hadn't seriously thought Assad's regime would collapse after that was signed, especially not after 4 years of the maintenance of his regime. In November 2024, just the day after Hezbollah and Israel signed a ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, HTS, the main rebel group in Syria, launched an offensive to oust Assad from power. It's a couple of things are interesting about the offensive. The first is that the offensive, unlike most military offensives launched by rebel forces, was largely nonviolent. By nonviolent, I don't mean that they intended to be nonviolent. Rather, what I mean is that nearly all of Assad's security forces laid down their arms or fought only very briefly. In fact, the rebel offensive was launched something like November 27th, and Assad fled the country on December 8th. So it was barely 2 weeks, more or less, and Syria's regime collapsed. And this is interesting because it suggests that Assad's regime was very much on its last legs by the time it collapsed, and didn't put up nearly much of a fight. There's an interesting question, which is like, why did it just take 10 days for a 50-year-long dictatorship to collapse after 13 previous years of civil war hadn't worked? One reason is that Syria historically had been an ally of Russia and Iran, and the Syrian government depended on Russian and Iranian support to stay in power. Russia was preoccupied in Ukraine. Iran was too busy having suffered from Israel strikes to intervene meaningfully, and as a consequence, neither came to his defense. But probably the much more compelling reason is just that Assad's regime was very poor by the time deterrence of aggression, which was the name given to the rebel offensive, was launched. There were mass shortages of food and fuel, hyperinflation, high levels of corruption. In fact, the primary way that Assad's regime was making money by the time his regime collapsed was by selling an illicit narcotic called Captagon. It was representing something like 90% of sales in the Middle Eastern region, which meant that more or less the territory under Assad's control was a de facto narco state. And one of the interesting ways that you can see just how poor Assad's regime had been by the time it fell was to look at nighttime illumination, which is sort of a crude proxy of sorts for economic activity. And there's this interesting study that looked at levels of illumination in territory controlled by the opposition, by the Kurds, the SDF, and by the regime. And what you'll notice is more or less the halving of nighttime light emissions in areas controlled by Assad between 2019 and 2024. The reason why that's relevant is by the time Assad's regime collapsed, many soldiers weren't willing to fight for his regime anymore. They had very little to gain from continuing the fight. And in fact, the rebels seemed to offer better quality governance and better quality of life. And as a consequence, huge numbers of soldiers that were previously loyal to the regime simply opted not to fight. So where does that leave Syria now? So Syria faces a series of sectarian and military and geopolitical divides, so it's worth going through all three. First, on sectarian divides, Syria has a Sunni majority population, but it does have substantial minorities both of Shias, Alawites. Alawites are the sect that the Assad family came from, and notably many Alawite elites were given substantial control over both Syrian enterprises and the Syrian military during Assad's regime, and Alawites remain a key source of tension in contemporary Syria, as well as the Druze and Christian minority. The Druze minority has ties to Israel. Part of the reason for this is that many Druze members serve in the Israeli defense forces in Israel, and Israel champions itself as a protector of Syria's Druze population. In addition, various Shia minorities various Shia minority militias have historical ties towards Iran. Of course, that has since weakened to a substantial degree. So the key military players then to be aware of are sort of fourfold. The first and the most important is HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That's led by Ahmed al-Shara, the current interim leader of Syria. Throughout the rebel offensive that ousted Assad, HTS received partial Turkish backing. And even prior to the rebel offensive, Turkey had some support for the HTS. Much more of Turkey's backing has gone towards a group called the SNA, the Syrian National Army, which was functionally created and funded by Turkey to fight the Kurds. The Kurds are a group called the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They have broader ties towards Iraqi Kurdistan, where there's a fairly well-established de facto Kurdish state, even though it's not officially recognized as such and still operates under the confines of Iraqi sovereignty. The SDF, or the Kurdish militia in the region, was the primary group backed by the United States during the campaign against ISIS. However, because the SDF has ties to the PKK, which is a group that for many decades Turkey has considered a terrorist organization, Turkey is very opposed to the SDF. Turkey, in fact, invaded on multiple occasions Syria in an attempt during the war to fight against the Kurds and created the SNA in large part to contain Kurdish influence in Syria. So the three major militias are HTS, a Sunni Islamist rebel movement; second, SDF, which is the Kurdish militia; and third, the SNA, which is the Turkish proxy force. There are also a series of regional militias. ISIS, for example, operates largely in the desert and doesn't have much territorial control. The United States has a limited military presence in the region, almost exclusively focused on taking out ISIS and cooperating with local forces to deal with the threat from ISIS. There is the National Guard, which is a Druze-based Israeli-backed militia. And then there are a series of Alawite militias that were most active during the Assad dictatorship, as well as during the early stages of the war. There's also geopolitical competition beyond just Israel, Turkey, and the United States in Syria. For example, Russia was majorly involved in the Syrian civil war, particularly with the use of air power. Part of the reason why Russia cares a lot about Syria is because Russia uses ports on the western coast of Syria and the Mediterranean to project power. For example, Wagner mercenaries have historically used airfields and ports in Syria to transport goods towards conflicts in Africa. For example, there is a huge presence of Wagner forces now in Western African states, where French forces have either withdrawn or been forced out in a wave of military coups in what's called the coup belt. So, for example, in a place like Niger, there's a substantial Wagner military presence, and previously much of the ways that Wagner paramilitary forces transited from Russia to Western or Central Africa and places like Niger was often through Syria as a proxy. Iran, of course, also used Syria for a similar purpose, which was to transport goods via a land bridge across Syria. Of course, that's much harder now that Assad has fallen. And now, although Iran has been much more badly weakened since June, Russia still seeks influence over Syria. One way it does that is through the sale of oil. Another, though, and a bit more immediate, is Russia seeks to retain its military bases in the country, and in particular, its control over the Tartus port, which is a warm water port, which means it operates year-round. So that's the kind of core major geopolitical issues at play. There's one other thing to note that I'll talk about in just a moment, which is Israel has occupied swaths of southwestern Syria since December 2024. Israel claims to have seized this territory as buffer in sort of an effort to protect itself against potential terror attacks. It's not clear whether or not Israel will ever seriously withdraw from that territory, which creates a major territorial problem for Syria in its southern regions. A couple of geographic flashpoints that are good to be familiar with. The first are coastal areas, which is where much of Syria's Alawite population resides. Those are the areas that are probably at the greatest risk of violence, either due to an Alawite insurgency or violence by Islamist or anti-Assad forces against Alawites that are perceived to have been pro-Assad. Second, are southern areas that contain large Druze communities. There was a major flare-up of violence in that region in a city called Suwaida back in July, when violence prompted Israel to launch airstrikes against Damascus and prompted after the Syrian central government sent the military into the region in an attempt to calm the situation down. Latakia was the site of major massacres that killed 1,600-ish people, the vast majority of them Alawite civilians, back in March. Some of the people involved in those massacres were members of government military forces, which is evidence of broader sectarian concerns and worries worries about the current interim government. Rojava, which is in the northeast of Syria, is largely Kurdish, and that, of course, is where there's lots of concerns about Turkish influence and the potential for SNA versus SDF violence. HTS is the major player, though, in Syria, and it's the group that you'll spend most time analyzing in debates about Syria. The main things to know about HTS are, first, it's an offshoot of Jabhat al-Nusra, which itself is sort of an al-Qaeda offshoot. But HTS itself explicitly split from al-Qaeda back in 2016 and explicitly fought against the Islamic State. That being said, there are very much factions of HTS that remain ideologically inclined towards radical conceptions of jihadism, and that potentially creates concerns for Ahmed al-Shara, the interim leader of Syria, in terms of managing those conflicts. The other thing to know about HTS is that it governed Idlib in the northwest of the country for about 5 years prior to the collapse of Assad's regime. The government in Idlib was largely authoritarian, but fairly technocratic. There are two things that people will typically say about HTS. One is that it's trying to turn Syria into an Islamist state. The second is that it has no serious intentions of democratizing Syria. The first is probably a weak claim empirically. The second is reasonably fair based on HTS's governing experience in Idlib. So Ahmed al-Shara has been in power now in Syria for about a year. And there have been some really quite notable successes, probably the most obvious being the absence of another civil war. The other being his diplomacy. Al-Shara has spoken in front of the United Nations, met with Trump in the Oval Office, and in doing so has extracted some pretty important sanctions relief. The most important sanctions relief that Syria needs is from what's called the Caesar Act, which was passed after a whistleblower informed Congress about torture committed by Assad. The Caesar Act is the toughest set of sanctions on Syria. There's currently an interim waiver on the Caesar Act. It's possible that the United States will offer a proper repeal of the Caesar Act in 2026, which would potentially aid with Syrian reconstruction. The major challenges facing Syria, though, are sort of three to fourfold. The first and the biggest challenge by a large margin is sectarian violence. At present, there are major tensions between the competing identity groups in Syria. To be clear, these are not religiously driven disputes. That is to say, they're not driven by disagreements, for example, about Islam. These are really disagreements centered around competing identity claims and the sort of historical wounds from the war. For example, there are lots of Sunni radical militants that are intent on revenge killings against Alawites that they perceive to have supported Assad's regime and military during the war. There are also groups that are opposed more broadly to Syria's multi-religious identity and wants to impose, for example, Islamic law across the country. As a consequence, there's a kind of constant tug of war between competing factions of the Syrian government and the Syrian security force, between those that recognize the need for a kind of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-sectarian identity, and those that are more intent, for instance, on retribution or on violence. The other relating concern, beyond the kind of concerns about Latakia or Suwaida occurring again, are concerns about insurgencies. There are large numbers of Syrian officials who there's kind of an interesting project going on in the New York Times to track the identities and locations of these, but there's large numbers of Assad's top generals, intelligence officers, etc., who potentially have interests to foment insurgency or violence against the regime. And there are real concerns that if Syrian reconstruction doesn't begin soon, that will soon get off the ground. The second basket of concerns facing Syria relates to integration and federalism. So at present, one of the major issues facing Syria is disagreements between the central government in Damascus and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces over military integration. So back in March, the SDF and the Syrian government signed an agreement in which SDF agreed to integrate into the broader military and to lay down arms as an independent militia. That agreement has not been fully implemented due to disagreements between the Kurdish militias in SDF as well as the Syrian government over details of that integration. Of course, that's concerning because failed military integrations are often a pathway towards violence and civil war. For example, much of the kind of basis for the ongoing conflict in Sudan relates to the failed integration of the Rapid Support Forces and Sudanese armed forces that led to the beginning of violence in April of 2023. The other concern relates to federalism. There are lots of religious and ethnic minorities in Syria that very reasonably are skeptical of HTS and worry deeply about living under HTS rule, and for that reason would prefer to see Syria decentralize power in a federalist structure. The central government is skeptical of those demands. Ahmed al-Shara has repeatedly rebuked those sorts of requests. There's a concern that that would foment separatist movements or potentially could even lead to the partition of Syria along sectarian lines. And so that's kind of a constant impasse as Syria moves forward in its political process. And then the sort of like last basket of issues that's worth highlighting facing Syria are the economic and political challenges of rebuilding after the war. For example, the Syrian economy lost something like 80% of its productive capacity over the last decade and a half, and it needs huge amounts of investment to reconstruct itself. Although sanctions relief has been provided, much of that sanctions relief hasn't yielded concrete, no pun intended, advancements in reconstruction, which means that unemployment remains a very large problem, as does energy shortages and blackouts. And politically, there are pretty major concerns about the future for Syrian democracy. So Ahmed al-Shara has pledged to build a pluralist Syrian government that features elections. The main concern is that Ahmed al-Shara and his kind of HTS regime is not genuine in pursuit of democracy. For example, there are pretty major concerns that the sort of recent elections, quote unquote, that the Syrian government held featured a very limited number of voters and a very limited number of candidates that were screened by Ahmed al-Shara himself. To be clear, that was the plan for those elections. It wasn't like a really badly done rigging, but there are major concerns that the promises to hold elections in the future won't actually materialize. And as a consequence, Syria might not become, say, an Islamist state in the way that some people have expressed concern, but it might potentially not shift to democracy. Part of the reason why people have deep concerns about sectarian violence in Syria, by the way, relates to the way that Assad framed opposition to his regime during the war. One of the most counterintuitive acts of the Syrian government during the early stages of the war was to support ISIS and jihadist organizations. So the most obvious evidence for this, there's a whistleblower report on this that's pretty interesting to read in case you're curious. But the hardest evidence for this was Assad releasing known Islamist militants with the explicit intention of those people joining or forming radical organizations, as well as the Assad military explicitly deprioritizing ISIS when fighting during the war, as well as purchasing oil from ISIS. So it's very confusing at first glance why the Assad regime would do these things. The main logic here was that the primary way that Assad characterized the opposition during the war was to characterize opposition as radical Islamic terrorists. And the way that Assad would typically justify his regime, even amidst the barrel bombing and sort of chemical weapons brutality, was to say, you know, like, the alternative to me is going to be much worse, and you don't want to like live under Muslim Brotherhood rule, etc. So one of the ways that Assad did that early in the war was more or less to make the conflict seem like it was Assad versus ISIS, and that's part of the reason why he made the he went to great efforts to strengthen ISIS somewhat counterintuitively, particularly in order to change Western perceptions of the conflict, but also to sort of lend credence to his characterization that if you're opposed to me, it's because you're a radical political Islamist. That, of course, is untrue. For example, large factions of the Syrian opposition were completely secular, and HTS hasn't shown any real indication in the slightest of trying to Islamicize Syrian society. But it is very much a lingering narrative about Syrian opposition, particularly in coastal areas, which potentially complicates efforts towards stable governance. The last thing I want to talk about are kind of miscellaneous conflicts that I haven't discussed in this presentation, but are very much worthy of learning about. One of them is the conflict in Sudan, which is one of the worst humanitarian tragedies that you can read about. Hundreds of thousands of children have already starved to death since the outbreak of the civil war. The violence has been so brutal that you can actually see cemeteries and blood from outer space through civilian satellites. The kind of short version of how we got here is the Sudanese civil war dates back decades, really, but its current impetus began in April of 2023 when a power struggle broke out between two competing factions of the Sudanese military. One is the RSF, the other is the SAF. At this point in time, both sides enjoy vast support from specific state sponsors. The SAF enjoys vast backing, particularly from Egypt and to a lesser extent from Saudi Arabia and Iran. The RSF is majorly backed by the United Arab Emirates, in part because the RSF controls lucrative gold mines in the west part of Sudan called the Darfur region. At this point in time, the conflict has kind of settled into what might be called a kind of brutal steady state, in which the western part of the country is largely dominated by the RSF. That wasn't entirely true until roughly October, when one major city called El Fasher fell from SAF control to the RSF. The fall of El Fasher was well documented as brutal and resulted in thousands of civilian casualties. And huge levels of violence. And in addition, the capital city of Khartoum was recaptured from the RSF by the SAF back in March, which means that more or less now the SAF controls much of the eastern and northern parts of the country. The RSF controls much of the west. This means that Sudan now has a de facto partitioned structure, but notably neither end in this conflict is a side to root for, in the sense that the SAF has been credibly accused of using child soldiers and chemical weapons. The RSF is actively committing genocide against ethnic black communities in the Darfur region, as it did decades previously as an outgrowth of what was called the Janjaweed militias, which was formed decades ago in previous iterations of the Sudanese conflict, as well as during the war for South Sudan's independence. The other conflict that you should be familiar with is the conflict in the Congo, specifically with respect to Kivu and in Rwanda. So the kind of historical context you should know here is during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Hutu extremists massacred hundreds of thousands of Tutsis as well as moderate Hutus. After the victory of the Tutsi majority Rwandan Patriotic Front, that's led by Paul Kagame, who remains the leader in Rwanda to this day, Hutu extremists fled to neighboring Congo. That subsequently led to the First and Second Congo Wars in a sort of complicated chain of events I won't fully outline here, but the important feature was that Rwanda invaded Eastern Congo on the basis of ousting genocidal factions of Hutu organizations that had set up camp in those regions. That led to the First Congo War. The ineffective peace deal after that eventually contributed to the Second Congo War. Those two conflicts claimed millions of lives collectively and set the groundwork for the contemporary conflict now ongoing in the Congo region, particularly the Eastern Congo. The way that this manifested into the current conflict relates to a group called M23. So after the end of the Second Congo Wars, a series of various Tutsi militias that operated in eastern DRC struck integration agreements with the central government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 2012, a disagreement between one of those major groups, which was eventually called the March 23 movement, you can guess the date in which this began, eventually caused a major conflict between M23, the Tutsi militia, and the DRC government and military. M23 briefly captured Goma, which is the capital city of the northern Kivu region in eastern DRC back in 2012, but that was eventually ousted after a UN-led peacekeeping mission in conjunction with UN Security Council sanctions on Rwanda, which played a major role in funding and arming the March 23 movement. Violence broke out again back in 2022 and 2023, but intensified largely in January of this year. 2025, that is. And it saw Rwandan and M23 forces recapture both substantial territory in North Kivu as well as in South Kivu, two regions both in the eastern part of the DRC. In June of 2025, the conflict's dynamics with respect to Rwanda changed notably. A peace deal mediated by the United States and Qatar successfully sort of saw negotiations between the Congo government and the Rwandan government. Just to be clear, when I say Congo government, I'm speaking here about the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The reason this doesn't end the conflict is because there are a range of militias, the most important amongst them M23, operating in Eastern Kivu that were not party to the peace deal. And Rwanda remains supportive of M23, particularly since the flare-up of violence back in 21 and 2022, even though Rwandan forces themselves have ostensibly pledged on paper to withdraw from the conflict. Notably, the international community has historically, particularly the UK, which is a major ally of Rwanda in the last 20 to 30 years, has historically provided vast support to Rwanda. Part of this is because the RPF has been one of the most stable regimes in Central Africa, in the sense that there is a relatively stable government under Kagame. It's worth noting that the stability of Kagame's government is driven in large part by his authoritarianism and violence towards opposition, but nonetheless, stability exists, and to some extent that explains the UK's policy of providing generous foreign aid to Rwanda. And Rwanda also plays a fairly large role in regional peacekeeping operations, which is part of the reason why international organizations, and particularly the UK, have been allied with Rwanda in the past. The consequence for that is basically that Rwanda has fairly substantial military and economic resources that it's supplied to the March 23 movement, which makes it difficult for the conflict to end. In particular, peace negotiations involving M23 have been largely ineffective in dealing with M23 versus DRC violence. There's also a series of broader organizations. For example, M23 belongs to what's called the Congo River Alliance, which is an alliance of broader militias operating, particularly in South and North Kivu. But it's a conflict that remains endemic, and the probability of U.S.-backed negotiations ending it seems limited. The United States' approach to diplomacy, particularly in African conflicts, has been highly performative and transactional, and has done relatively little to address the underlying causes of conflict, as opposed to papering over it with relatively brief peace deals. The other thing that's worth noting about the Democratic Republic of the Congo is the centrality of Congo's cobalt sector to global mining. Something like 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo region, and that has major implications for things like batteries and computers and electric vehicles and even solar panels, where copper is a very important metal due to its very valuable metallic properties. The problem, of course, is that the Congo extraction industry in the Democratic Republic of the Congo suffers from massive, massive human rights concerns, particularly with respect to the use of slave labor, even within Chinese corporations that have tried to claim a relatively humanitarian characterization of their labor practices in the region. So that's the context on Congo. The last conflict that I alluded to earlier but didn't spend much time discussing is Venezuela, which is, if I had to guess, a conflict that's more likely to show up, particularly at Sophia Worlds, although I have no real idea if that prediction will end up becoming true. The context you should know on Venezuela is roughly this. Hugo Chavez governed the country as a socialist president for many years. After his death, he passed the torch towards Nicolas Maduro, who has been in power since roughly the early mid-2010s. Maduro is an illegitimate president. He's lost multiple elections, but stayed in power chiefly through electoral fraud. He's also governed the country in a highly kleptocratic and corrupt manner that saw vast reductions in Venezuela's wealth, as well as huge humanitarian suffering. Approximately a quarter of Venezuela's population has already fled the country. There's what's the so-called Maduro diet of people having suffered from a caloric deficit as a consequence of food shortages in Maduro's Venezuela. And Maduro has deployed police and military force to suppress opposition towards his regime. Now, in the first Trump administration, the there were proposals for the United States to take military action against Venezuela. Those ended up not happening. The U.S. opted for stiff sanctions that were partially relaxed by the Biden administration. Those were largely reimposed by the Biden administration after the July 2024 elections, which Maduro outright stole from the opposition candidate. Nearly every major international watchdog and observer agrees that Maduro lost the elections and stayed in power illegitimately. Notably, Venezuela enjoys support from principally two groups. The first is Cuba, the second is Russia. And Venezuela also has vast oil reserves, although much of Venezuela's ability to sell oil is limited in large part due to international sanctions, largely imposed by the United States and its EU allies. Since coming into power in January, the Trump administration has taken a fairly different approach to Venezuela than it did in the first term. First of all, the rhetoric that Trump has deployed around Venezuela has changed to become markedly more escalatory. So the United States raised the bounty on Maduro's head. The United States has openly categorized Maduro as a drug kingpin and narco terrorist who is responsible for the production of cocaine and fentanyl and shipping that to the United States. There is some limited truth to the claim that Venezuela is involved in the production and transportation of illicit narcotics, but the specific claim that like Maduro is single-handedly running the world's largest narcotics operation is largely baseless. That's not to justify Maduro's human rights abuses. It's just to note that the specific rationale provided by the Trump administration for targeting Venezuela seems empirically weak. The more important actions, though, that Trump has taken against Venezuela is twofold. The first are airstrikes against boats allegedly operated by Venezuelan narco-terrorists. The word allegedly here is fairly important. The United States, by this point in time, has killed over 80 people in these airstrikes, despite having very limited legal basis to do so. There's no concrete evidence that these boats are actually carrying drugs, and because they're blown up, there's no real way to confirm or to tell this. There's rising congressional and broader skepticism of the strikes in the United States, and it's not clear exactly whether Republicans will intervene more harshly to demand that clarity be provided or evidence be provided as to whether these boats are actually carrying narco-terrorists and drugs. The second in the perhaps long-term more consequential action by the Trump administration is the deployment of a huge amount of military force in the Caribbean region. The logic is a bit unclear. It's not clear if this is just a show of force intended to blackmail Maduro into stepping down voluntarily. It seems unlikely that Maduro will do this. He's been in power stably since sort of 2015-ish and has survived a huge number of people leaving his regime, vast unpopularity domestically, and so forth. And the fact that he has a fairly well-orchestrated patronage network of military generals and business oligarchs and security officials around him probably means most likely Maduro thinks that he can stay in power. Maduro has become increasingly forceful in his own rhetoric about the United States and has mobilized large numbers of people to the country's defense. Tensions between Venezuela and Essequibo, the neighboring region in Guyana, have also been on the rise for the last several years. Guyana has large offshore oil deposits that have made the country substantially richer in recent years. Of course, Venezuela considers Essequibo to be legitimately Venezuelan territory, which creates a dispute between the two countries. The United States now has enough military power, though, in the region that it potentially could seek regime change against Maduro. The question is whether or not the United States would be willing to do so. There's obviously huge risks of entanglement should the United States seek to oust Maduro. For example, the United States, famously was entangled in Vietnam for over a decade, the same in Afghanistan for 2 decades functionally, and about 8 years in Iraq back in 2003. And even if the United States doesn't get entangled in nation building, for example, in Venezuela, there are major concerns that if the United States militarily intervenes in Venezuela, it's not going to result in what happened in Panama in 1989, where the dictator is removed and a new government is swiftly imposed relatively peacefully. There's a real concern of a civil war breaking out in the country or of regional instability spreading into neighboring Colombia, where there's a fragile peace with FARC, which signed a peace deal back in 2016, or even into Brazil, where Trump has terrible relations with Lula on the basis of the prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, who attempted to overturn election results after he was ousted from power back in 2022/23. All of this means that the United States potentially will seek regime change against Maduro's regime. The United States has far more weapons in the region than it had when it pursued regime change against Muammar al-Gaddafi back in Libya in 2011. And so there's a very real chance that the United States will do this. One of the other reasons to believe that regime change is potentially coming is that the United States has allocated so much military power to the region that it seems risky for Trump to back down, because there's a potential for Trump to look weak, and Trump probably cares very much about that not being a narrative about him. Of course, if the United States opts to intervene, the relevant question is who comes next. The best outcome for Venezuela is that the democratically elected opposition assumes power. The main concern is that the military strives to gain influence, or that opposition leaders are killed or unable to gain power safely or quickly, causing the country to devolve into a relative state of instability. So that's all I have for this presentation. Hope this helps. Best of luck in upcoming tournaments.